She was 65 years old, soaked to the bone, and riding for her life. Behind her, 3 hired men were closing in through the storm. Ahead, nothing but darkness, mud, and open Nebraska prairie. Martha Whitmore hadn't slept in 2 days. Her hands were bleeding where the rains had cut into her palms. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to stop. But stopping meant surrender. Surrender meant signing away everything her husband had bled to build. So she rode. She rode until the lightning showed her a single dim light burning through the cottonwood trees, and a stranger's door that would change everything. Drop a comment with your city. Let me see how far this story travels. The summer of 1875 came to the Nebraska plains like a punishment. For 3 weeks running, the sky had been building towards something, stacking clouds on clouds, pressing heat down onto the yellowed grass until the whole world felt like the inside of a fist. Cattle along the Loup River stood still in their pastures, heads low, as though waiting for a verdict. The meadowlarks had gone quiet. Even the wind, usually constant in that part of the country, had died down to a breathless hush that made the silence louder than sound. Old-timers said it was the kind of weather that preceded catastrophe. They weren't wrong. The storm broke on a Tuesday evening, just as the last orange light bled out of the western horizon. It didn't start with sprinkles or polite warning drops. It arrived the way violence arrives, suddenly, completely, with no negotiation. One moment the sky was bruised purple. The next, the whole world turned white with lightning, and the thunder came rolling in like a freight train that had jumped its rails and decided the earth itself was the track. Martha Whitmore felt the first crack of thunder in her chest before she heard it with her ears. She was already riding hard. Her horse, a sturdy gray quarter horse she called Smoke, had been galloping for the better part of an hour, and even a horse as solid and steady-nerved as Smoke was beginning to show the strain. His breath came in ragged, wet bursts. His hooves threw up sheets of mud with every stride. Martha leaned forward over his neck, trying to reduce the drag, trying to give him every advantage she could, because she knew, with absolute bone-deep certainty, that the men behind her would not stop. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The lightning obliged her with a full, terrible illumination. 3 riders. Still back, maybe a quarter mile, but gaining. She recognized the one in front by the pale hat he wore, Caldwell, her stepson's top man, a former cattle enforcer out of Dodge City with a reputation that had preceded him to the Whitmore Ranch, like a shadow arrives before the person who casts it. He was not a man who gave up. He was not a man who had ever been given a reason to. Martha turned back to the darkness ahead and rode harder. She was 65 years old. That fact had a different weight now than it had carried 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. At 63, she'd still been throwing hay bales. At 64, she'd ridden the full fence line of the western pasture alone. But the last winter had taken something from her, a deep, grinding cold that had settled into her hip joints and her lower back and refused to fully leave, even in the warmth of spring. She felt it now, every stride of the horse sending a jolt of pain radiating up her spine and across her ribs. Her breath was coming too fast, too shallow. Her hands, she could barely feel them anymore. But she did not stop, because stopping meant going back. Going back meant Harlan Cole, her husband's son from a first marriage. Martha had been Thomas Whitmore's second wife, had married him when she was 32 and he was 40, had spent 33 years building a life with him on that ranch, the Whitmore Double W, 480 acres of the best grazing land in the Loup River Valley. They had worked it together, Thomas and Martha. They had buried 2 children who came too soon into the world and couldn't stay. They had survived drought and cattle disease and a grasshopper plague in '74 that stripped their fields down to nothing and still somehow held on. They had grown old together in the way that people grow old when they have loved each other honestly, not without hardship, but with a kind of settled, unshakable knowing that made the hardships bearable. Thomas had died 14 months ago. Heart gave out on him in the south pasture on a cold March morning. Martha had found him herself, kneeling in the mud, holding his face in her hands, talking to him long after she knew he couldn't hear her anymore. Harlan had arrived at the funeral with a lawyer. That should have told her everything she needed to know. Thomas's will was clear. The ranch went to Martha, all of it, in full, with no conditions and no encumbrances. Harlan received a cash sum and the farm equipment stored in the eastern barn, which was more than fair considering that Harlan had never once put his hands in the Whitmore soil, had not visited his father in the last 11 years of the man's life, and had spent those years running various schemes and speculations out of Omaha with varying degrees of success and consistent degrees of ethics. But Harlan had looked at the Double W and seen something that didn't match the terms of a will. He had seen 480 acres of prime riverfront land at a moment when the railroad was coming through and land prices were climbing like morning glory on a fence post. He had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had told him that what he stood to gain was worth whatever it cost to take it. The harassment had started small. A fence cut here, a water source fouled there. A rider appearing at the edge of the property at odd hours, just sitting on his horse and watching. Then the letters started. Letters that questioned Martha's mental capacity, that suggested her age made her unfit to manage the property, that proposed in increasingly pointed language that the sensible thing would be for her to transfer management to Harlan, just temporarily, just while things were being sorted out. She had burned every one of those letters in the kitchen stove and gone back to work. Then 3 weeks ago, Harlan had come himself. He'd arrived with 2 men she didn't recognize and a document she had never asked for, a deed of transfer, already written out, waiting only for her signature. "It's for your own good, Martha," he had said. He was a lean man, Harlan, with his father's height, but none of his father's solidity. He wore his clothes well and he smiled often, but his eyes were the eyes of someone doing constant calculation. "You're out here alone. Anything could happen. You're not as young as you used to be." "I was here before you ever set foot on this ranch," Martha had told him, "and I'll be here long after you've gone." His smile hadn't changed. "I hope that's true." It was the way he said it, the quiet flatness beneath the polished surface. That told her the conversation had shifted into something else entirely. She had asked them to leave. They had left, but Caldwell had stayed. She'd seen him twice that week, riding the ridgeline above the north pasture. Once at dusk, she'd found boot prints outside her kitchen window in the fresh mud. Someone had stood there long enough to leave a deep impression. The door to the smokehouse had been found open one morning, the latch forced from outside. Martha had packed a bag that night. She'd taken Thomas's old letters, the deed to the ranch, the small metal lockbox that contained their marriage certificate, and the original homestead filing, and she had loaded Smoke with enough provisions for 3 days of riding. She had written a note and left it with her closest neighbor, a Finnish woman named Ingrid Maki, who lived 12 miles east and who had been a steady and quiet friend for 20 years. She had ridden out before dawn. She had made it 4 hours before they found her trail. The rain was coming sideways now. Martha could no longer see the riders behind her. She could no longer see much of anything. The lightning came in irregular intervals, and in the seconds between, the darkness was absolute. She was riding by instinct, by the feel of the land beneath Smoke's hooves, by the small compass she held in her left hand and could barely read. She was trying to reach Fort Carson, 60 miles northwest, where she knew there were people she could trust. The marshal there, a man named Hewitt, had known Thomas. And there was a woman named Agnes Parker who ran a boarding house and who had a reputation, quietly spread among those who needed it, for helping women find their footing when the ground had been pulled out from under them. But 60 miles was a very long way in a storm. Smoke stumbled. It was a small thing, a slip in the mud, quickly corrected, but Martha felt it in every joint in her body, and more than that, she felt it in the way the horse's gait changed afterward, a slight favoring of the left foreleg that told her even Smoke was reaching his limit. "Easy," she murmured, straightening, pulling back just slightly on the reins. "Easy, old friend." She was looking for somewhere to stop. Not to stop permanently. Stopping permanently was not an option, but to wait out the worst of the storm, to let Smoke rest for an hour, to get out of the rain long enough to check his leg and check her own bearings. The lightning came again, a long, branching crack that lit the whole plain, and in that single illuminated second, she saw it. A cabin, low and square, built into a shallow rise in the ground so that it looked as though the prairie itself had pushed it up from beneath. A line of cottonwood trees behind it, their branches wild in the wind. And in the single small window, a light. Dim and steady, yellow and warm, the specific quality of light that a person makes when they are settled in for the night and have no reason to expect visitors. Martha had been riding toward trouble for 6 hours. Now she turned smoke toward that light like a woman who had run out of other choices. His name, she would later learn, was Daniel Holt. He was 38 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who spend their lives outdoors often look older, weathered rather than aged. The lines in his face, the product of wind and sun, and long silences rather than the softer erosion of an easy life lived indoors. He was not a large man, but he was built with the particular kind of quiet density that belongs to people who have done hard work for so long that the work has become structural. It lives in the shoulders, in the way the back holds itself, in the steadiness of the hands. He was a route rider, which is to say he had no fixed employment and no fixed address, but rather a loose circuit of ranches and outposts across a 200-mile stretch of Nebraska and Kansas that needed occasional labor, fence repair, horse management, winter feed hauling, the various jobs that accumulate on a working ranch and cannot always wait for permanent hands. He was reliable, which was his primary reputation, and quiet, which was his secondary one. And those two qualities together made him something of a fixture on the route. The sort of man whose absence would be noted, but whose presence was so unassuming that it was easy to take for granted. He had been in the cabin for 3 days, sheltering between jobs. The cabin belonged to a rancher named Jessup, who had given him use of it over the years in exchange for maintaining the fences on the eastern line. It wasn't much. 1 room, a stone fireplace, a rough pine table, 2 chairs, a bunk built into the wall. But it was dry, and it was solid. And on a night like this, solid and dry were the 2 most important qualities a structure could possess. He was reading a battered copy of a surveyor's almanac that he'd found under the bunk sometime the previous winter, when he heard the horse outside. He set down the almanac. In that part of the country, in that era, a horse arriving at your door in the middle of a storm at close to midnight was not necessarily cause for alarm, but it was cause for attention. He crossed to the fireplace first and picked up his rifle. A Henry repeating rifle, well-maintained, which he propped against the wall within reach but not in hand. Then he moved to the door, lifted the latch, and opened it. The woman on the horse was barely staying in the saddle. She was soaked completely through, her clothes plastered flat against her, her gray hair loose from whatever it had been pinned in and hanging in wet ropes across her face. One hand held the reins, the other was pressed flat against her side in the way a person presses when something hurts. Her face, in the light from the doorway, was the face of someone who had made a decision about pain, had acknowledged it, set it aside, and chosen to keep moving regardless. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said nothing for a moment. Then, with the particular directness of a woman who has been too exhausted for anything but honesty, she said, "I'm afraid of you." He didn't move, didn't speak. "I want you to know that," she continued. Her voice was steady in a way that told him the steadiness was costing her something. "I'm afraid of you because I don't know you, and I've been riding away from men I do know, and I have no reason to believe you're different from them. I want you to know I said that, so that whatever happens next, it was honest." Daniel Holt looked at the old woman on the horse. He looked at the way her hands were shaking. He looked at the mud caking her boots, and the blood on her right palm where the reins had worn through, and the particular angle of her shoulders, which was the angle of someone who has used up most of what they had. He stepped to the side. Not backward, not forward, to the side. "You can come in," he said. "If you want to. Door's open. The choice is yours." Martha Whitmore sat on her horse for 3 full seconds, looking at the open door, at the firelight beyond it, at the man who had stepped aside rather than aside. Then she dismounted, slowly, carefully, with a barely suppressed sound of pain as her hip took her weight, and she led Smoke to the small lean-to at the side of the cabin, and she went inside. He gave her a blanket first. He didn't ask her name or where she'd come from, or who was chasing her, because he could see she'd been chased, the same way you can see when an animal has been running from something, some quality of the stop motion that still carries the urgency of the motion itself. He just took a second blanket from the chest at the foot of the bunk and held it out, and she took it and wrapped it around herself and sat down in the chair closest to the fire. He put a pot of water on. He checked on her horse, went out into the rain without being asked, spent 10 minutes in the lean-to, came back and reported that the left foreleg was tender but not injured, that Smoke had been given water and hay and was settling. He said this briefly, factually, without asking for thanks, and then he went back to the fire and poured hot water over coffee grounds and set a cup on the table beside her. Martha held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth move into her fingers and up her wrists, and she sat with that for a long moment, eyes closed, just breathing. "Thank you," she said finally. "You're welcome." Silence. The fire crackled. Rain hammered the roof in long, shifting waves. "My name is Martha Whitmore," she said. "Daniel Holt." "Do you know the Whitmore Double W? Out near the Lou, south of here about 40 miles? "I know of it," he said. "Never worked it. Heard it was good land." "It is," she said. "Was my husband's. Mine now." She paused. "Someone wants to make it theirs." Daniel said nothing, which was not the same as having nothing to say. Martha looked into the fire. She was quiet for a moment, arranging something, not the words, which were simple enough, but the act of saying them to a stranger, which required a different kind of courage than the courage that had kept her on Smoke's back through 3 hours of storm. "His name is Harlan Cole," she said. "My husband's son from before me. He wants the ranch. He's been at it for a year. Letters first, then interference, then threats that weren't quite threats, if you understand me. The kind of thing where the man can look at you with a straight face afterward and say he never said what he said." She took a sip of the coffee. "3 weeks ago he came himself. Brought a deed of transfer. I threw them off the property." Her jaw tightened. "Tonight he sent men to bring me back. Caldwell, you know the name?" Daniel's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but she caught it. "I know the name," he said. "Then you know what I'm dealing with." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him directly then. She had blue eyes, very clear, the kind of blue that doesn't fade with age, but rather distills itself, becomes more concentrated, more specific. "I'm trying to reach Fort Carson. There's a marshal there named Hewitt who knew my husband. And there's a woman named Agnes Parker who I've been told can help me find somewhere safe while—" She stopped. "While I figure out what comes next." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the fire. He was quiet for a moment. "Fort Carson's 60 miles, he said. "I know. In this weather, on a horse that's already winded, with men behind you who won't wait out the storm." He paused. "You can't do it tonight. I know that too. Caldwell will have to shelter somewhere. He won't ride in this. Too dark, too much chance of a horse breaking a leg." He looked up at her. "You've got until dawn, maybe a little past. If you sleep for 4 hours, take the ravine route northeast toward the Cedar Creek line, you can put enough distance between you and them that they'd have to track you instead of chase you, and tracking slows a man down considerably." Martha looked at him. "You'd know the ravine route?" "I've ridden this stretch for going on 12 years, he said simply. She was quiet again. There was something she needed to say, and she was trying to find the precise, honest way to say it. "I have no money on me," she said at last. "I have the deed to my ranch and my husband's letters and a marriage certificate, and when this is settled, I'll have something to offer. But right now, I don't want paying," Daniel said. His voice was even, not offended, not generous in a showy way, just factual. "I'm not doing anything yet. I'm just telling you what I know about the country. And if I asked you to do something—" He looked at her again with that steady, measuring look. "Then I'd have to decide if it was the right thing to do," he said. "And tell you either way." Martha Whitmore had lived 65 years and been married to an honest man for 33 of them, and she knew honesty when she heard it. She nodded once, short and decided. "Then I'm asking," she said, "if you'll ride with me to Fort Carson." Daniel Holt looked at the fire for a long moment. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch till dawn." She slept for 3 hours in the bunk, which was more sleep than she'd had in 2 days, and less than her body wanted, but more than the situation could honestly afford. When she woke, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and a pale gray light was beginning to push at the edges of the horizon. Not quite dawn, but its preliminary announcement. Daniel was sitting at the table with the almanac open again, but she could see from the state of the fire, recently built up, not burned low and restoked, that he had been tending it through the night. There was a plate of food on the table near her side. Dried beef, a piece of hard cornbread, a cup of water. She sat up, ate without ceremony, and looked at him while she did. Tell me what you know about Caldwell, she said. Daniel set down the almanac. He seemed to consider how much to say, and then he seemed to decide that the situation didn't allow for the luxury of partial truths. I worked a ranch 2 years back south of here toward the Kansas line, he said. Caldwell came through working for a man named Prescott. Another land dispute, different circumstances. The family he was hired against was a younger couple, newlyweds, homesteaders. They'd filed legal and proper. Didn't matter. He paused. They left. Didn't have any other choice after a while. Prescott got the land. Did anyone get hurt? Daniel's expression told her the answer before he said it. The husband had an accident, he said carefully. Nobody proved anything. Martha finished the cornbread and drank the water. Then we need to go. Yes, ma'am, we do. He had already saddled Smoke and his own horse, a dark bay he called simply Bay, which she thought was either the least imaginative name she'd ever heard for a horse or the most honest one. Both animals were tied outside the lean-to, provisioned for the ride. He had also, she noticed, packed his saddlebags with more than a day's supplies, a deliberate act, she understood, made before she'd even woken up. She didn't say anything about that, just put on her coat, which had dried overnight near the fire, and picked up her bundle and followed him out. The prairie after a storm had a quality unlike any other. The smell of it, wet sage and crushed grass and clean mud and something electric still lingering in the air, was almost overwhelming in its freshness. The sky was clearing from the west, the last clouds pulling back like a curtain being drawn, revealing a dome of pale morning blue that had the washed, temporary look of something just cleaned. The grass was silver with water. In the distance, a meadowlark started up, tentative at first, then committed, filling the silence with something that was almost embarrassingly hopeful for that hour of the morning. Martha put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up onto Smoke's back with the slow, gritted determination of someone refusing to show pain in front of someone they'd just asked for help. Daniel mounted Bay and looked back at the cabin once, briefly, without sentiment, and then north-northeast, where the ravine route began. Stay close, he said quietly. And if I tell you to stop, stop. And if I tell you to stop, she said. He looked at her. There might have been the beginning of something in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the country a smile comes from. Then I'll stop, he said, and they rode. Daniel Holt rode the way some men read, efficiently, without show, processing information faster than he visibly reacted to it. Martha watched him in the first hour and began to understand how he had survived 12 years of cross-country route work. He was perpetually reading the land. He would look at the horizon, then at the ground directly ahead, then at some middle distance to the right or left, then back to the horizon. A rotating scan that never quite settled, that kept everything in the picture. He noticed tracks before she could have found them. He read the behavior of birds the way other men read weather vanes. When a pair of crows suddenly lifted from a stand of scrub oak half a mile to the south, he altered course without explanation, moving them diagonally across a long, shallow swale until the scrub oak was between them and whatever had disturbed the crows. What was that? Martha asked. Don't know yet, he said. Might be nothing, might be a coyote. He didn't look back. Better to not find out. The ravine route was not a road or a trail. It was a series of natural depressions in the land, low-lying channels carved by centuries of snowmelt and spring flooding, deep enough to hide a rider from anyone watching from the high ground. It was slow going. The footing was uncertain in places, the mud still soft from the night's rain, and twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through narrow passages between limestone outcroppings. But it kept them off the ridgelines, and it kept them invisible, and on this particular morning, those were the two things that mattered most. Martha talked as they rode. She hadn't planned to. She was not by nature an overly talkative woman. Thomas had always said that she spoke only when she had something worth saying, which he claimed was either the most admirable quality a person could have or the most intimidating, depending on which side of it you were on. But there was something about moving through the land with Daniel Holt beside her that loosened something. Perhaps it was the relief of still being alive and moving. Perhaps it was the particular quality of his listening. He listened the way the land did, without judgment, without visible reaction, simply receiving what was offered. She told him about the ranch, about the early years when she and Thomas had first come out from Ohio with nothing but a wagon, and the homestead filing and the specific unreasonable confidence of people who have decided to attempt something that might be impossible. About the first winter, which had nearly broken them, about the gradual accumulation of years and work and what that accumulation built, not just in the land but between two people who had decided to face the same direction. "He was a good man," she said, not mournfully, factually. Not a perfect one, stubborn in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not. Bad with accounts until I took them over. Couldn't cook to save his life. She paused. But honest. Never once said anything to me that he didn't mean. I knew where I stood with him every day for 33 years. "That's not a small thing," Daniel said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They rode in silence for a while. The sun was up now, properly, burning the last of the storm's moisture off the grass. "Harlan came to the funeral," she said eventually. "With a lawyer." She said it flatly, without drama, but the flatness itself contained the drama, compressed it, concentrated it. Thomas had been in the ground for 11 hours. 11 hours. She shook her head. I looked at that lawyer's face and I thought, this is what my husband's son thinks of his father's life. This is the value he assigns to 33 years of work. What did you do? I told the lawyer he was welcome to attend the burial service if he wished to pay his respects, and that any business matters could be directed to our attorney in town, Mr. Caleb Marsh, who would be handling the estate. Then I walked away, and I didn't look back. She paused. Thomas would have done the same. He was good at walking away from things that didn't deserve his attention. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You said there are letters," he said, "from your husband." "Yes, a bundle of them. From before we were married and from after, during the times he rode to market and I stayed back at the ranch, and one he wrote the winter before he died when he thought he might not make it through." She touched the bundle tied to her saddle without looking at it. "He was a thorough man. He kept records of things, notes on finances, notes on the ranch management, notes on conversations he'd had with people about the property over the years." She paused again. "I think some of what's in those letters may matter legally. I won't know until I can sit with Mr. Marsh and read through them properly." "Do you trust this marshal in Fort Carson, Hewitt?" "I trust that he was honest with Thomas," she said carefully. "Thomas's judgment on people was sound. I'm choosing to extend that trust until I'm shown otherwise." It was the most she would commit to, she thought. Trust extended as a working hypothesis, provisional, subject to evidence. It was the only kind of trust that made sense when the ground was uncertain. Daniel nodded slowly, as though she had said something that confirmed something else. They were 3 hours out from the cabin, moving well, the ravine route having delivered them north with a useful combination of speed and concealment, when Martha heard it. She heard it before Daniel did, or at least before he gave any sign of having heard it, which she was beginning to understand might not be the same thing. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming from the southeast, not running, but moving purposefully, at a steady trot that covered ground efficiently. "Daniel," she said, "I hear it." He was already looking left, scanning the terrain. They were in a wide section of the ravine here, exposed on the western side where the limestone wall had broken down into a long, rubbled slope. Exposed was the wrong word to be. "Ahead or back?" she asked. "Ahead," he said. "There's a cutoff, 300 yards, tight but passable." He looked at her directly, a quick, assessing look. "Can you push Smoke?" She answered by touching her heels to Smoke's sides. They moved fast. Daniel pulled ahead slightly, not to leave her, but to navigate. She followed his line exactly, mirroring his choices about where to step and where to angle, trusting his knowledge of the terrain the way you trust a lead rope in darkness. The cutoff appeared as a narrow slot in the eastern wall of the ravine, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, opening into a secondary gully that ran perpendicular, heading northeast. They went in single file, Daniel first, then Martha, and the limestone walls closed around them like a door pulled shut. She pressed herself low against Smoke's neck, feeling the rough stone brush her shoulder as they passed through the narrowest point. Smoke, bless him, didn't shy, just moved forward at her direction with the solid reliability that had made her love him for 7 years. They came out into the secondary gully, and Daniel held up a hand. They stopped. Listened. The hoofbeats came closer, closer. They were clearly in the main ravine now. Martha could hear the change in the sound as the horses moved through the wider space, hooves on the rocky floor carrying and echoing. Then voices. She didn't catch the words at first. Too much distance, too much echo. But then the wind shifted slightly, and she heard it clearly. A man's voice, flat and unhurried, saying, "Tracks go north, definitely. She's been through here." A second voice. "There's a fork ahead somewhere. Jessup's place is—" "We're not going to Jessup's. She'd have been there last night. She's not there now." Martha recognized the first voice. Caldwell. She was very still. Beside her, Daniel was equally still. Completely, professionally still. The stillness of a man who has done this before, who knows that horses will betray you through nervousness if you betray them through yours. Bay and Smoke stood like stones. The voices moved north. The hoofbeats moved north. Growing more distant, not less. They had passed the cutoff, either not seen it or not thought to look. Martha let out a breath that she had been holding for what felt like a very long time. Daniel waited another 2 full minutes in silence before he moved. "They're ahead of us now," he said quietly, "on the main ravine heading north. We need to angle east, take longer, but keeps us off their line." "How much longer?" "Half a day," he said. "We'd come into Fort Carson from the east instead of north, but we'd come in." She looked at him. "Then we go east." The half-day became a full day and more. The eastern route took them across open prairie for a long stretch where there was no natural cover, and they moved through that stretch at a pace that was careful rather than cautious, the careful pace of people who have accepted risk and are managing it rather than eliminating it, because eliminating it was no longer an option. The sun was high and fierce. Martha's hip was burning steadily now, not in waves, but in a constant baseline of pain that she had reorganized herself around, building her posture and her focus and her determination in a ring around it and refusing to let it be the center of things. Daniel noticed. He couldn't have missed it, the way she shifted in the saddle at intervals, the way she favored the left side, the way her jaw was set in the second half of the afternoon, with a precision that was less the precision of determination and more the precision of someone who has nothing left to spend on anything but what is absolutely necessary. He called a halt at a shallow creek that cut through a fold in the prairie, letting the horses drink. He didn't make a production of it, didn't say anything about rest or pain or the state of things. He simply stopped, dismounted, and when Martha dismounted, he was nearby without being demonstratively nearby. She knelt at the creek and splashed water on her face. "How far?" she asked. 12 miles, he said. 3 hours at current pace." She sat back on her heels and looked at the water for a moment. The creek was clear after the storm, running quick over smooth brown stones. A pair of killdeer worked the opposite bank, ignoring them completely. "I was a good rider," she said, not regretfully, analytically. 10 years ago I could have done this without it touching me." "You're doing fine," Daniel said. "I'm doing what's necessary," she said, which was different. She looked up at him. "I want you to know, when we get to Fort Carson and this is sorted, I won't be one of those people who behaves as though hardship never happened. I know what this cost. I'll know what your help cost." She held his gaze. "That matters to me." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't need to matter to you on my account," he said carefully. "I'm here because it's the right thing to be." "It matters anyway," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment, that measuring, unhurried look, and nodded. "All right," he said. "Then it matters." They remounted and rode on. The last 12 miles carried them through the long amber light of late afternoon, across grass that was still damp and rich-smelling from the storm, past a line of box elders that marked a buried stream, up a long gradual rise that gave them, at its crest, the first sight of Fort Carson, the low line of its rooftops, the square of the garrison walls, the water tower, and above it all the flag, which from this distance was just a small rectangle of color moving in the wind. Martha stopped at the crest of the rise. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she straightened in the saddle, deliberately, painfully, completely, and rode down toward it. Fort Carson was not a large settlement, but it was an established one, which in the Nebraska of 1875 meant something. It had a garrison, a church, a courthouse, a hotel, 3 saloons, a bank, a doctor's office, and a main street that was mud in spring and dust in summer, and something ambiguous in between the rest of the time. It had the particular quality of permanence that comes not from age but from intention. Buildings built to last, roads laid out in straight lines, the general impression of a community that had looked at the frontier and decided to stay. Agnes Parker's boarding house sat on the eastern edge of the main street, a 2-story frame building painted white, which was unusual enough in that context to be noticeable. Most buildings in Fort Carson were the natural gray-brown of weathered lumber, and the white paint stood out like a declaration. Above the door was a small sign, Parker's Boarding House. Rooms, meals, and respectable company. There was a light in the parlor window. Daniel helped Martha dismount, an offer she accepted without ceremony, which told him more than any words about how much the last 20 hours had taken from her. He tied both horses to the post outside and knocked. Agnes Parker opened the door herself. She was perhaps 50, a broad-shouldered, compact woman with red hair gone mostly to gray and the kind of face that had been lived in thoroughly and looked better for it. She took in the situation in a single practice sweep, the elderly woman, the mud, the exhaustion, the cowboy standing half a step behind, and stepped back without hesitation. "Come inside," she said. It was not a question or an invitation so much as a fact being stated. The parlor was warm, well lit, and entirely orderly, a quality that felt, in the context of the last 20 hours, almost surreal. There were 3 other women in the room, one young, perhaps 20, who looked up from her sewing with the alert, slightly guarded look of someone accustomed to paying attention to arrivals. One middle-aged, gray-haired, reading near the window. One elderly, asleep in an armchair near the fire. Agnes sat Martha in the best chair. She just pointed at it, no ceremony, and sent the young woman for tea and food and hot water, and she pulled a footstool over and sat on it directly in front of Martha and said, "Tell me what happened." Martha told her, concisely, completely, without drama. The ranch, the will, Harlan, Caldwell, the storm, Daniel, the ride. Agnes listened with the focused attention of someone taking a legal deposition. When Martha finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. "The marshal," she said. "Hewitt. You said your husband knew him." "Yes." "Then we go to Hewitt tomorrow morning," Agnes said, simply, as though this were a logistical matter and not an extraordinary crisis. "He's a careful man. He'll want evidence." She looked at the bundle from Martha's saddle, which Daniel had brought in and set on the table. "Are those the letters?" "And the deed, and the marriage certificate." Agnes nodded. "Good." She looked at Daniel. "You rode with her?" "Yes, ma'am." "You saw the riders in the ravine?" "Heard them. Identified Caldwell by voice. Mrs. Whitmore confirmed it." Agnes looked at him for a long moment. "You'll be willing to tell that to Hewitt?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a beat longer, that same measuring quality Martha had recognized in Daniel, but warmer, more open. Then she looked back at Martha. "You're safe here," she said. "Whatever that means to you right now, I want you to hear it. You are safe in this house." She stood up. "We'll talk more in the morning. Tonight you eat, and you sleep, and you let tomorrow be tomorrow's problem." Martha looked at her. "That's not a small thing either," she said quietly. Agnes Parker allowed herself something that was close to a smile. "No," she agreed. "It isn't, but it's what we have, and it's enough." Outside, Daniel stood with the horses in the early dark of the Fort Carson evening, listening to the sounds of the settlement settling in for the night, doors closing, a piano starting up somewhere down the street, the low murmur of voices from the saloon. He thought about 12 years of riding the same country and how in 12 years you could learn every ravine and ridgeline and shallow creek and still arrive somewhere you hadn't been before. He thought about a woman who had said, "I'm afraid of you," with the specific courage of someone who has decided that honesty matters more than self-protection. He thought that she was going to be all right. Not easily, not without cost, but all right. He unsaddled the horses and led them to the livery at the end of the street, and he made sure they were properly tended before he thought about himself at all, because that was simply the order in which things were done. Then he walked back to Agnes Parker's boarding house and knocked again, and asked if there was a room, and Agnes Parker said yes, and he went inside and sat down at the table and had the first full meal he'd eaten since the previous day. And outside, the Nebraska sky was clearing completely now. The last clouds gone, the stars coming out one by one, and then all at once, the way they do on the plains after a storm, so bright and so numerous that the sky looks almost implausibly full, as though someone has been saving them up. Martha Whitmore was asleep before the candle on the nightstand burned down an inch. For the first time in more than a year, she did not dream of Harlan. The morning came in slowly at Fort Carson, the way mornings do after a storm has wrung everything out, pale and clean and careful, as though the world was feeling out its own edges again before committing to the full weight of the day. Martha was awake before the light. She had slept for 9 hours, which was more than she'd slept in a single stretch since the month Thomas died, and she woke disoriented in the way you wake in an unfamiliar room. That brief, suspended moment where the mind is assembling the present from scattered pieces of recent memory, fitting them together until the picture resolves, and you understand where you are and why. The room Agnes had given her was small and white-walled, with a single window that faced east. There was a washstand with a china bowl and a clean towel folded over its edge, a braided rug on the plank floor, a quilt on the bed that was faded but whole, the kind of quilt made with the intention of lasting. She lay still for a few minutes and listened to the sounds of Fort Carson waking up, horses in the street, a door somewhere, the distant rhythmic clang of someone at a forge starting early. Simple sounds, ordinary sounds, and she received each of them as though they were something she'd been given rather than simply heard, because after the last 24 hours the ordinary had acquired a quality it didn't always have. She got up, washed her face, pinned her hair, and went downstairs. Agnes was already in the kitchen, which Martha suspected was where Agnes always was at this hour, and probably most hours. There was coffee on the stove and bread on the table, and Agnes was standing at the window with a cup in her hand, looking at the street with the attentive, slightly abstracted expression of a woman who is thinking hard about something and using the view as a screen to think against. She heard Martha on the stairs and turned without surprise. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Sit down." Martha sat down and poured herself a cup and waited. "I've been thinking," Agnes said, still at the window, "about the order of things today." "Tell me." Agnes turned and leaned against the counter. In the morning light, she looked both softer and harder than she had the previous night. Softer in the way people look when the performance of competence isn't being demanded of them yet. Harder in the way that comes from having thought something all the way through and reached a conclusion you intend to act on. "Hewitt first," she said, "before Harlan's men have a chance to find you here and complicate the situation. I know Hewitt's schedule. He's at his office by 7. We go at 7:15. Early enough that the street's quiet, late enough that he's had his coffee and isn't talking to anyone yet." "Does Hewitt know you?" Martha asked. "Well enough," Agnes said. There was something in the compression of those two words that suggested a longer story Martha didn't have time to hear just now. "He respects careful people. You walk in there with those letters and the deed and Daniel's account of last night, and you give it to him straight and organized, and he'll listen. What he decides to do with it is his business, but he'll listen. And if Caldwell is already in town," Agnes's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A brief tightening, then a deliberate relaxation. "Then we deal with that when it's real," she said. "Not before." Daniel came down 20 minutes later, looking as though he had slept adequately, and considered that sufficient. He had cleaned up, fresh shirt, boots brushed, and he accepted the coffee Agnes handed him and stood near the doorway and listened while Agnes laid out the morning's plan with the concise efficiency of a woman who has organized difficult things before and has no patience for either panic or unnecessary deliberation. He asked 2 questions. The first was whether Agnes knew if Hewitt had dealt with land fraud cases before. The second was the layout of the marshal's office, specifically whether it had a back entrance. Agnes answered both questions without asking why he wanted to know, which told Martha something about the kind of conversations Agnes Parker was accustomed to having in her kitchen. At 7:10, the 3 of them walked out into the cool morning street of Fort Carson and turned toward the marshal's office. Martha carried Thomas's bundle under her arm like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Marshal Elias Hewitt was a lean, deliberate man of 52 who had the kind of face that had absorbed a great deal of information over the years and processed most of it privately. He wore his badge with the unconscious ease of long habit rather than the self-consciousness of pride. And when Agnes Parker walked into his office, followed by an elderly woman he didn't recognize and a rote rider he did, he'd seen Daniel Holt around Fort Carson twice over the years, enough to have formed an impression. He set down his coffee cup and gave them his full attention. He said nothing while Martha talked. He was a listener of the particular professional variety that never quite lets you know how much is landing. His face remained composed and neutral throughout, not cold but carefully uninformative, the face of a man who has learned that showing his hand early helps nobody. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, his eyes moving to the bundle she had set on his desk. "May I?" he said. "That's why I brought them," Martha said. He untied the bundle carefully and spread the contents on his desk with the methodical attention of someone who understands that how you handle paper tells you things the paper doesn't say directly. He looked at the deed first, read it thoroughly, not skimming, but reading, moving his lips slightly on the legal language the way some people do when they want to be certain they've understood precisely. Then the marriage certificate. Then the first two of Thomas's letters. He set them down and looked at Martha. "Your husband's handwriting," he said. "You'd recognize it without question?" "I would," she said. "I watched him write most of those." "Were any of these written to you directly, as in, addressed to you?" "The last one, the winter letter. He wrote it when he thought he might not recover from the fever he had in January of '74. He addressed it to me by name." She paused. He also wrote down, in that letter, a summary of the ranch's financial situation as he understood it at the time, including a note about an approach Harlan had made to him 2 years before his death about buying the property, which Thomas refused, and his reasons for the refusal. Hewitt looked at her steadily. He documented the approach? He documented everything. It was his nature. Hewitt picked up the winter letter. He read it with the same careful attention he'd given the deed. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that a room acquires when something important is happening and everyone in it has the sense to let it. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at Daniel. "You heard Caldwell's voice in the ravine." "Yes, sir." Identified him by voice and confirmed with Mrs. Whitmore. He made reference to tracking her trail and knowing she'd been at Jessup's cabin the previous night. "That places him in active pursuit." "Yes, sir." After a ride she'd taken in the middle of the night in a storm, not a circumstance that suggests she had much choice about leaving her property. Hewitt's mouth compressed slightly. It might have been acknowledgement. "You know Caldwell's reputation," he said to Daniel. It wasn't a question. "I do." "So do I," Hewitt said. He looked at all three of them in turn, not rapidly but deliberately, taking his time. Then he looked back at the papers on his desk and was silent for a long moment. Martha waited. She had been waiting for over a year. She could wait another minute. "This letter," Hewitt said finally, touching the winter letter without picking it up, "if it can be authenticated, and a man's documented handwriting over 33 years of correspondence is fairly authenticatable, then what you have here is a contemporaneous record of Harlan Cole's prior attempt to acquire this property, refused, and documented by the owner himself." "That's not nothing, Mrs. Whitmore." He paused. "But fraud and coercion are serious charges. I need more than letters to move on them. I need to know if there's a legal record, anything filed, anything through an attorney." "Caleb Marsh," Martha said, "in Dorsey. He handled Thomas's estate. He has copies of the will and the deed filing. He would also have received any legal correspondence from Harlan's lawyer." "Marsh," Hewitt repeated. He seemed to turn the name over in his mind. "Marsh is a careful man. If there's something filed, he'll have it, and he'll have kept it clean." He straightened in his chair. "I'm going to send a wire to Dorsey this morning. In the meantime," he looked at Martha directly, "you stay in Agnes's house. You don't go out on the main street without someone from this office with you. And if Caldwell shows his face in Fort Carson, I want to know about it before he knows I know." "Can you hold him?" Daniel asked. "On what I have right now?" "No," Hewitt said flatly. "I need to build something first. But Caldwell's been in my territory before, and we have an understanding of sorts." The way he said it left no ambiguity about the nature of the understanding. "He knows the limits of what I'll tolerate." He paused again. Mrs. Whitmore, your stepson, where is he, as of your knowledge? Omaha, ordinarily, but he may have traveled closer in anticipation of— She stopped. In anticipation of resolving the matter. Meaning he may already be in the territory. It's possible. Hewitt nodded slowly. Then we move quickly, he said, and carefully. He looked at Agnes. Keep her close. I always do, Agnes said simply. They were back at the boarding house by 8:30, and the morning had the peculiar quality of a wound spring. Everything ready to move, nothing yet moving, the tension of potential action that hadn't yet found its form. Martha sat at the table in Agnes's parlor with Thomas's letters spread before her and went through them systematically, not reading them in the way of grief or memory, but in the way of evidence, looking for dates, for names, for the specific documented facts that a court of law would care about, and that Thomas, in his thorough, unhurried way, had been recording for years without knowing he was building a case. The young woman Martha had noticed the previous evening, whose name she had learned over breakfast, was Clara, 22, widowed by a farm accident 6 months past and staying with Agnes while she decided what came next, sat nearby mending a shirt and watching Martha work with a combination of curiosity and the kind of careful respect that young people sometimes show to old people who are doing something unmistakably serious. After a while, Clara said, "Do you want me to write things down as you find them? To keep a list?" Martha looked up. "Can you write clearly?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother was a school teacher." "Then yes," Martha said. "I'd be grateful." They worked together through the mid-morning, Martha reading, Clara writing in her clear school-teacher-trained hand. What emerged over the course of 2 hours was a document that surprised even Martha in its completeness. Thomas had, over the years, made note of 4 separate approaches from Harlan regarding the ranch, 2 during his lifetime, documented in letters to Caleb Marsh that Thomas had kept copies of. One overheard conversation documented in a private journal entry that Thomas had apparently kept irregularly but honestly, and the winter letter's direct account of Harlan's last pre-death approach and Thomas's refusal of it. There was also something else, something Martha found in the 3rd letter from the bottom of the bundle, a letter Thomas had written to Marsh in the spring of 1873, the content of which she had not remembered because she had not been aware of it. Thomas had sent this one without mentioning it to her, which he did occasionally with business matters he thought she had enough else on her mind about. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the wall for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara asked, "are you all right?" "I'm thinking," Martha said. What Thomas had written to Marsh in the spring of 1873 was a request to investigate the financial history of Harlan Cole's business activities in Omaha. He had done this because Harlan had, in one of his approaches, made reference to certain debts he was carrying and suggested that a loan against the ranch's equity, just a loan, entirely repayable, just something to help him get clear, would be a reasonable thing for a father to do for his son. Thomas had said no, as he always did, but something about the conversation had troubled him enough that he'd written to Marsh and asked him to look quietly into Harlan's affairs. What Marsh had reported back, and Thomas had kept that letter too, folded inside his letter to Marsh as though he'd intended to send it somewhere and hadn't quite gotten around to it, was that Harlan Cole had, in the preceding 4 years, been involved in 3 separate property acquisition schemes in the Omaha area, 2 of which had resulted in legal disputes and 1 of which had resulted in a settlement paid to a family named Greer, under circumstances that Marsh described, with his characteristic careful language, as suggestive of coercive intent. Martha set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you understand its weight. "Clara," she said, "add this one to the list separately. Mark it with 2 stars. Shub." Daniel had spent the morning differently. He had walked Fort Carson with the particular invisible thoroughness of a man accustomed to reading the landscape for information. He was not asking questions or drawing attention. He was simply present in the way that a person who belongs to a place is present, unremarkable, unnoticed, moving through the geography of the town and building a picture. He found what he was looking for at the livery on the south end of the main street, where a hostler named Pete Gruber was watering horses, and keeping the kind of comprehensive mental record of who had ridden into town and what they'd come on that is the specific professional habit of men who spend their lives around other people's horses. Daniel leaned on the fence rail and admired a roan in the second stall and made the kind of idle, gradual conversation that is not really idle at all. 3 men had ridden in from the south that morning. Come in early, just at dawn. 2 he didn't know. The third wore a pale hat and rode a tall, well-fed black horse and had not left a name. Paid for stabling for 2 days. Asked casually whether there was anyone in town by the name of Whitmore. Daniel kept his face relaxed and his voice even. That's so, he said. Didn't tell him nothing, Pete Gruber said. There was something in the way he said it, a slight emphasis, a decision communicated rather than just reported. Don't generally answer questions about other folks' business. That's a good policy, Daniel said. He left the livery and walked directly to the marshal's office. Hewitt listened to him without interrupting. When Daniel finished, the marshal leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers on the desk once, just once, with the controlled patience of a man whose internal alarm was registering significant and who was choosing how to respond to it carefully. He's already here, Hewitt said. Caldwell, not Harlan himself. But Caldwell being here suggests Harlan knows she's in Fort Carson, or suspects it. How would he know? Caldwell tracked her trail to Jessup's cabin. From there, anyone who knows the territory would reason north to Fort Carson. It's the only place of size in that direction with a law presence. He paused. Caldwell's smart. He wouldn't have ridden 40 miles at dawn to make a social call. Hewitt stood up. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it. I'm going to have a conversation with our visitor, he said. Not an arrest. I don't have grounds yet. A conversation. The kind that makes clear that certain behaviors will not be accommodated in my jurisdiction. He looked at Daniel. You go back to Agnes's house. You stay there until I come to you. And if Caldwell moves toward Agnes's house before you get to him? Hewitt looked at him with the level, unambiguous look of a man who has carried a badge for 20 years and knows exactly what it means. Then, he said quietly, you do what needs doing, and I'll account for it after. Daniel held the look for a moment, then nodded and went. The conversation between Hewitt and Caldwell took place on the front step of the hotel, which was public enough to be witnessed and private enough in the mid-morning quiet that raised voices would have been conspicuous. Hewitt was brief. Those who later described the scene, the hotel clerk, a passing merchant, said it looked like 2 men discussing the weather, except for the quality of attention both were paying and the particular stillness of the man in the pale hat, the stillness of a person who is receiving information and calculating rather than simply listening. What Hewitt said, stripped to its elements, was this. He was aware of the nature of Caldwell's presence in Fort Carson. He was aware of Caldwell's history in the territory, and there was a woman currently under his protection in connection with a legal matter that was now formally in process. Any interference with that woman, her associates, or the legal proceedings underway would be treated as obstruction and dealt with accordingly. Caldwell said very little. He was not a man who said much in circumstances where saying much was disadvantageous. He asked once whether the marshal had any formal documentation. Hewitt said, Not yet. Caldwell let that sit for a moment, and then he said, Then I expect we'll see how things develop, and he went back inside the hotel. Hewitt stood on the step for a moment after he'd gone. He didn't like the sound of "we'll see how things develop." He had been doing this long enough to know that those words, from that kind of man, were not an expression of passivity. They were a schedule. He walked back to his office and sent 3 wires in rapid succession, one to Caleb Marsh in Dorsey, one to the county courthouse in North Platte, requesting records related to the Whitmore estate filing, and one to a contact in Omaha whose usefulness he rarely invoked, but had found reliable on the 2 previous occasions he'd needed it. Then he sat down at his desk and began writing out what he had. By noon, the boarding house had the particular atmosphere of a place that is outwardly calm and inwardly braced. Agnes moved through the house with her usual unhurried efficiency, but Martha had been around capable women long enough to recognize the difference between unconcerned efficiency and composed efficiency, and what Agnes was displaying was the latter, she knew, and she was managing knowing it with the specific quality of someone who has faced difficult things before and has made her peace with the fact that facing difficult things is simply what some lives require. The other women in the house, Clara, the middle-aged woman named Ruth, and the elderly woman Agnes had introduced as Mrs. Delaney, who was apparently a permanent resident rather than a transitional one, went about their days with a conscious normality that had something almost ceremonial about it. Nobody talked about Caldwell or the marshal or the letters. They talked about the weather clearing, about a bolt of blue calico Ruth had seen at the dry goods store, about whether Mrs. Delaney's rheumatism was better or worse after the storm. Martha sat with them and participated and let the ordinariness of the conversation do the work it was doing, which was not insignificant. Daniel sat near the front window of the parlor for most of the afternoon. He wasn't watching the street in any obvious way. He was mending a piece of tack, his hands occupied, his attention apparently devoted to the leather strap he was working. But Martha, who had spent 33 years married to a man who could keep watch while appearing entirely occupied with something else, recognized the posture exactly. At one point in the mid-afternoon, Clara brought them both coffee and lingered a moment. She looked at Daniel and then at Martha and then said, in the perfectly direct way of someone who is young enough not to have learned the art of indirect approach, "Is this going to be all right?" Martha looked at her. There were several answers to that question, and she considered them honestly before she chose one. "I believe it will be," she said. "That's not the same as knowing it will be. But belief is what you act on when knowing isn't available." Clara considered this. "My mother used to say something like that," she said. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman." "She was," Clara said with the particular past tense of recent loss. Martha looked at her for a moment. The 22-year-old widow with the schoolteacher mother and the clear handwriting and the 6 months of deciding what came next, and felt something that was not quite recognition but adjacent to it. The specific solidarity of women who have had the ground pulled out from under them and are in the process of finding new ground. "You'll be all right too," Martha said, not as comfort, as assessment. Clara held her look for a moment, then nodded once, short and decided, in a way that was startlingly familiar, and went back to her work. But the wire from Caleb Marsh arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon. Hewitt came to Agnes's house himself to deliver it, which told Martha something about its contents before he said a word. He came in and sat down at the parlor table, and Agnes closed the door between the parlor and the rest of the house without being asked, and Hewitt unfolded the wire and read it aloud in the measured, even voice of someone who is reading carefully because the words matter. Marsh had responded to Hewitt's inquiry with the thoroughness that was, evidently, his professional signature. He confirmed that he held the original will, notarized and filed in the county records 3 months before Thomas Whitmore's death. Thomas had been careful about that timing, apparently, had gone to Marsh specifically to ensure the filing was in order while he was still well enough to oversee it himself. He confirmed that the estate transfer to Martha was complete, legal, and unambiguous. He confirmed that he had received and retained copies of 2 letters from Thomas Whitmore requesting investigation of Harlan Cole's business activities. And then there was the item at the bottom of the wire, the one that made Hewitt read slowly and made Martha very still. Marsh had, in the months since Thomas's death, received 3 separate contacts from a law firm in Omaha acting on Harlan Cole's behalf, contacts that Marsh described, in the clipped efficiency of wire language, as, first, an inquiry into the will's contestability, second, a request for information about Martha's mental and physical capacity to manage the property, and third, most recently, a request for information about whether the property deed could be challenged on the grounds of a prior claim dating to an earlier period of ownership. That third contact, Marsh had noted, was accompanied by documentation that appeared to be a falsified earlier deed, one that, if accepted as legitimate, would predate Thomas's homestead filing and suggest a prior ownership claim that could, potentially, cloud the title. The falsified deed. Martha heard the words and sat with them. Harlan had not simply been threatening and pressuring, he had been constructing, building a paper architecture of fraud, layer by layer, designed to give his claim the appearance of legal legitimacy. The letters, the deed transfer, the intimidation, none of it had been improvisation. It had been a planned sequence, Each step meant to either force her signature or build the false record that would make a signature unnecessary. "He had the document made," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's Marsh's interpretation," Hewitt said carefully. "It hasn't been proven yet, but Marsh is not a man who uses the word falsified lightly. He'll have looked at it closely before he put it in a wire." He folded the paper. "This is enough for me to begin a formal investigation. I'm going to request a judicial review from the district court in North Platte. That takes a few days to establish, but once it's filed, it creates a legal record that makes any action Harlan takes in the meantime an interference with proceedings." He looked at Martha. "In practical terms, that means he has to stop. Or he's not just committing fraud, he's committing contempt." "What about Caldwell?" Daniel said. "I've spoken to Caldwell. He knows the situation." Hewitt's voice carried the same compressed weight it had earlier. "He's calculating. Men like Caldwell always are. The question is whether his calculation includes the possibility that this goes badly for him personally, and whether that possibility is weighted heavily enough to change his behavior." "What makes it heavier?" Martha asked. Hewitt looked at her. "Evidence," he said simply. "Every additional piece of legitimate evidence makes the entire enterprise more expensive for Harlan and more dangerous for Caldwell. At some point, the math changes." He paused. "We are working toward that point." "How long?" she said. "If Marsh sends the physical documents by the next stage, 2 days, perhaps 3. If the court in North Platte moves quickly on the filing, another 2 after that." He watched her. "Can you hold here for 5 days, Mrs. Whitmore?" Martha thought about the word hold. She had been holding for 14 months. She had ridden 40 miles through a storm. She had sat in this parlor all afternoon reading letters and making lists and waiting, and she would wait 5 more days, or 50 more, if that was what it required. "Yes," she said. "I can hold." Hewitt nodded. He gathered his papers and stood up and put on his hat, and at the door he paused and turned back. He looked at Agnes. "The Greer matter," he said. It was not quite a question. Agnes met his look evenly. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "The Greer family," Hewitt said, now addressing Martha directly, "was the family in Omaha that Harlan's previous coercive acquisition involved. They settled rather than pursue the case, but they settled under pressure, and there may be, if they're willing to speak, testimony that establishes a pattern of behavior that predates his attempt on your property." He paused. "A pattern is much harder to defend against than an isolated incident." Martha looked at him steadily. "Find them," she said. "I intend to," Hewitt said, and went out. But the evening was quiet in the way that evenings are quiet when people have done everything they can do and are waiting for what comes next, and the waiting has its own particular weight. Agnes made supper. A proper supper, not perfunctory, the kind of meal that communicates something about the cook's conviction that the people eating it deserve the care that goes into it. They ate together around the big table in the kitchen, all of them, Martha, Daniel, Agnes, Clara, Ruth, Mrs. Delaney. The conversation was ordinary again, that conscious, effortful ordinariness, and underneath it, in the spaces between words, was the acknowledgement, shared and unspoken, of what the day had contained. After supper, when the others had drifted toward their rooms, Martha and Daniel sat on the back steps of the boarding house in the cooling evening air. The sky to the west was a deep, clear indigo, the last light holding along the horizon in a thin, precise line of amber. Stars were beginning. For a while, neither of them said anything, which was not uncomfortable. They had ridden most of a day together in a condition of mostly practical silence, and had arrived at the specific ease that sometimes develops between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to each other. "You could have turned me away," Martha said eventually. Not with emotion, just noting it, placing it on the record between them. "No," Daniel said. He said it simply, without expansion, as though the simplicity of the word was the entirety of the answer, which perhaps it was. Martha looked at the horizon line. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. "He had a lot of respect for people who did things because they were right, rather than because they were profitable." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "What was he like?" he said. "As a man?" It was a question people rarely asked about the dead. They asked about accomplishments, about events, about what the person had done. They rarely asked about what the person had been like, as a man, as a daily presence, as a specific weight in the world. The fact that he asked it that way told her something. He was patient, she said. Patient in a way that I used to think was just his temperament, but I came to understand over the years was actually a decision. He chose patience the way some people choose anger, consciously, repeatedly, because he had decided it was the better tool. She paused. He was funny, not in a performing way, in a quiet way, the kind of funny that only lands for the person in the room who's paying attention. He'd say something, completely straight-faced, and a minute later you'd realize what he'd said, and he'd be watching you from the corner of his eye waiting for it. Daniel smiled at that. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face in the specific way that some people's smiles change their faces entirely, as though the smile is the room the face actually lives in, and everything else is just the anteroom. "You miss him," he said. "Every day," she said. Not mournfully, factually. But not in the way that stops you, in the way that walks beside you. She looked up at the emerging stars. He'd have been furious about Harlan, not in an explosive way, in the cold, quiet way that was much more frightening. She paused. He'd have handled it differently than I have. He had a talent for calling a bluff that I lack. I tend to go straight at things. A beat. It's gotten me into trouble more than once. It got you out of that ranch before Caldwell could corner you, Daniel said. Sometimes going straight at things is the only way. She thought about that. She thought about Smoke's back and the storm and the darkness and the single light in the cottonwood trees, and how all of it had been the consequence of a choice she had made quickly, in the middle of the night, without consultation, on the basis of her own reading of the situation. And the reading had been right. Thomas would have approved of that, she thought. Whatever else could be said about the last 48 hours, the reading had been right. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. It carried more weight than the words themselves. Not gratitude for a service rendered, but acknowledgement of a person, the specific acknowledgement that says, "I see you and what you did, and it mattered." He received it the way he received most things, quietly, without deflection or performance. "You're welcome, Martha," he said. The stars were fully out now, thick and indiscriminate. The Nebraska sky doing what it did on clear nights in summer, filling so completely that it looked less like a sky and more like a decision. They sat there a while longer in the cooling dark, two people who had not known each other 3 days ago, sitting at the back of Agnes Parker's white boarding house in Fort Carson, waiting for the law to do its work, and the days to pass, and the thing that had been set in motion to arrive at wherever it was going. Inside, a lamp went on in the kitchen window, throwing a rectangle of yellow light out onto the ground. Somewhere down the street, a horse moved in a stable. The prairie, in all directions, was silent and immense and indifferent in the way the prairie always was, which was not an unkind indifference, but simply the indifference of something that has been here longer than any human trouble and will be here long after it has resolved. Martha breathed in the night air and thought, 5 days. She could hold. The 5 days did not pass quietly. The first day was the easiest, in the way that the first day of a difficult thing is often easier than the days that follow. There is still the momentum of action carrying you forward, the sense of having moved, having done, having set things in motion. Martha woke on the second morning in Agnes's white room and felt the stillness of waiting settle over her like a second blanket, heavier than the first, and understood that this was the part that would require a different kind of strength than riding through a storm. Hewitt came by on the second morning with a brief report. The documents from Marsh were on the stage, due the following day. The wire to his Omaha contact had gone unanswered, which was not necessarily ominous but was worth noting. And Caldwell had not left the hotel, or at least had not been seen to leave. That last item was the one that sat with Martha through the rest of the morning, because a man like Caldwell, sitting still in a hotel room, was not a man resting. It was a man thinking. And a thinking Caldwell was a more complicated problem than a moving one. Daniel continued his quiet patrol of the boarding house's perimeter, not conspicuously, not in any way that would draw attention, but present in the specific way of someone who has decided that presence itself is the task. He repaired a hinge on the back gate that had been loose. He restacked firewood that had been knocked sideways in the storm. He talked to Pete Gruber at the livery once a day, gathering the information that liverymen accumulate the way certain birds accumulate bright objects, not purposefully, but comprehensively. On the second afternoon, Gruber reported that Caldwell's two companions had ridden out south, which could mean they were going back to report or could mean they were riding a circuit of the approaches to Fort Carson. Daniel thought it was the latter. He told Hewitt, and Hewitt agreed and sent two of his deputies out on the northern road as a visible counterweight. On the third morning, the stage arrived from Dorsey, and Caleb Marsh arrived with it. Martha had not expected him in person. She had pictured his documents coming by box, handled by strangers, and had spent 2 days constructing a scenario in which the letters and the deed transfer certificates and the correspondence about the false prior deed were sufficient on their own to carry the argument. The sight of Marsh himself stepping down from the stage, a compact 50-year-old man with silver-rimmed spectacles and a battered leather satchel that looked as though it contained the entire record of every difficult transaction he had ever overseen, was the first moment since Fort Carson that Martha felt something she was careful not to call relief. Hope was more accurate. The specific qualified hope of someone who sees reinforcement arriving and understands that reinforcement is not the same as victory, but is a necessary condition of it. Marsh came directly to Agnes's house. He greeted Martha with a handshake rather than the condescending pat on the shoulder or the sympathetic half-bow that some men of his profession deployed with elderly women, and she appreciated him for it. "You look better than I expected," he said, which was lawyer, for you look tired, and I expected worse. "Sit down, Caleb," she said. "Tell me what you brought." He brought a great deal. Over the next 2 hours, spread across Agnes's parlor table, Marsh laid out the documentation with the systematic care of a man building a structure that needed to hold weight. The original will, notarized and filed, with the county recorder's certification. The deed of transfer, complete and unambiguous. Copies of his correspondence with Harlan's Omaha lawyers. 3 letters, each one more revealing than the last, each one demonstrating a slightly different angle of the same underlying attempt. And most significantly, the document that Marsh had identified as the falsified prior deed, a piece of paper claiming that a man named Aldous Breck had held a homestead claim on the Double W land prior to Thomas Whitmore's filing, a claim that would, if legitimate, create a competing title that could cloud Martha's ownership for years of litigation, regardless of the outcome. Marsh set this document in the center of the table and said nothing for a moment, letting it sit there and be looked at. It was well made. Martha had to grant it that. The paper was aged convincingly, the handwriting careful, the notarization seal plausibly executed. Someone had spent real money on this. "Aldous Breck," Martha said. "Does not appear in any homestead record, any county filing, or any census record for this territory in the relevant period," Marsh said. "I checked personally. I also had a contact at the county surveyor's office, checked the land records going back to the original government survey. There is no prior claim. Aldous Breck, as a property holder in this territory, did not exist." He paused. "Whoever created this document created the man along with it." Daniel, who had been standing near the window, said quietly, "How long would it take a court to disprove it without your investigation?" Marsh looked at him over his spectacles with the assessing look of a lawyer encountering an unexpectedly precise question from an unexpected source. "Without the research I've done, a court would have to conduct its own investigation. That's 6 months minimum, possibly a year, during which time the title would be considered clouded and managing the property would be legally complicated." He paused. "That's assuming a sympathetic judge. A judge with any reason to favor Harlan's position could drag it considerably longer." "But with your research," Martha said. "With my research, and with what Hewitt has been building, and with the letters your husband wrote, we have a case for fraud that is, in my professional opinion, strong." He looked at her directly. "Not certain. A court is never certain until it rules. But strong." Martha put her hands flat on the table and looked at the falsified deed and thought about the man who had commissioned it, who had sat in his Omaha office and calculated that this piece of paper, this fiction of Aldous Breck, was worth whatever he'd paid to have it manufactured, because the math of 480 acres of riverland had told him the investment was sound. Thomas had documented the prior approach. Marsh had investigated the Omaha history. Hewitt was building the obstruction case, and somewhere in the middle of all of it was a woman who had ridden 40 miles through a storm with bleeding hands and a hip that burned with every stride, and who had arrived at a stranger's door and said, "I'm afraid of you because the truth seemed more important than self-protection." The architecture of the case was real. It was solid. It was not yet enough. "We need the Greer family," Martha said. Marsh looked at her. "Hewitt mentioned them. He's been trying to locate them. Do you know anything?" Marsh was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who knows something and is deciding whether to say it yet. Then, "I received a wire this morning before the stage left, from a colleague in Omaha." He reached into the satchel and produced a folded paper. "The Greers are in Council Bluffs. Father and daughter. The son-in-law, who originally dealt with Harlan, passed away 2 years ago. The daughter, a woman named Frances Greer, is apparently—" He paused, found the phrase in the wire. "Apparently not disinclined to speak on the matter if properly approached." The room was quiet for a moment. Agnes, who had been sitting in the corner chair throughout with her coffee and her careful listening, said, "Then someone needs to go to Council Bluffs." Everyone at the table understood that the someone could not be Martha. It was Hewitt who made the decision the following morning, with the directness of a man who has gathered enough information to know what the next step is and sees no advantage in delay. He would send one of his deputies to Council Bluffs with a formal request for Frances Greer's testimony. Marsh would provide a legal deposition form. The deputy, a young man named Aldrich, who Hewitt described as reliable and unremarkable, which were the qualities the errand required, would leave on the afternoon stage. This was all being arranged, and Martha was sitting with Marsh at the parlor table going through the letter sequence one more time, building the narrative that the court would need to follow, when Clara came quietly into the parlor from the kitchen. "Daniel needs to speak to you," she said to Martha. "Outside." The way she said it, not alarmed, but careful, the specific carefulness of someone who has been asked to deliver a message without the message's freight, told Martha what she needed to know before she reached the back door. Daniel was in the narrow alley behind the boarding house. He was holding Bay's reins. Both horses, Bay and Smoke, were saddled. "Caldwell left the hotel an hour ago," he said. His voice was level, but his eyes were not idle. "With both his men, they rode northeast." Martha understood immediately. "The ravine route. He knows we came in that way. He's going back to cut off the eastern approach." He paused. "Hewitt's deputies are on the north road. There's nobody watching the eastern approach." "He's not trying to stop us from leaving," Martha said slowly, working it out. "He's trying to intercept something coming in." Daniel looked at her. "The stage from Council Bluffs comes in from the east," he said. "Aldrich leaves today. If Caldwell knows or suspects that someone is being sent for testimony, can he know that? He's been in this town for 3 days. Men like Caldwell don't sit still. They listen." He held her look. "If he intercepts Aldrich before Aldrich reaches Council Bluffs or intercepts whoever comes back with testimony." He didn't finish the sentence because it didn't need finishing. Martha thought about the falsified deed on Marsh's table. She thought about Harlan sitting in Omaha calculating investment returns. She thought about how close the whole architecture was to being complete, days away, possibly, and what it would mean if one crucial piece of it was prevented from arriving. "I need to tell Hewitt," she said. "I sent Clara to the marshal's office already," Daniel said. "But Hewitt is in a meeting with the county judge. Marsh had requested an emergency consultation about the fraud filing. He can't be pulled out without—" He stopped. "It'll take 30 minutes to reach him. And Caldwell has an hour's head start. Yes?" Martha looked at the horses. She looked at Daniel. She looked at the sky above the alley, which was clear and blue and entirely indifferent to the problem she was standing inside of. Then she looked at her hands, the right palm still raw where the rains had cut it, healing but not healed. "Where would he set up?" she asked. Daniel had clearly already thought about this. "There's a narrow ravine about 8 miles east on the main approach road. Coming in from Council Bluffs, you have to go through it. It's the only passable route where the creek crossing is manageable. If he wants to intercept someone coming from that direction, that's where he does it." "Then that's where we go," Martha said. He looked at her for a long moment. It was not a look that contained objection. more a look that was doing its due diligence, accounting for the relevant facts before confirming the conclusion. Her age, her hip, the fact that she had already ridden 40 miles in deteriorating condition less than 4 days ago. Against all of that, the precision of her thinking, the quality of her decision-making under pressure, the fact that she was right. "Ride close," he said. Same as before. They rode out the back gate. 8 miles from Fort Carson, the land begins to lower itself toward a network of creek drainages that cut through the limestone shelf underlying the prairie, and the road from the east, such as it was, a double track worn into the grass by years of wagon and horse traffic, threads between two of these drainages through a passage that is, at its narrowest, perhaps 30 yards wide with limestone walls rising 8 feet on either side. Local people called it simply the Gap, with the matter-of-fact naming of people who have lived beside a geographic feature long enough that it becomes furniture. Daniel and Martha reached the rise above the gap with enough time, barely, to see what was below. Caldwell and his 2 men had positioned themselves with competence, one man on each side of the ravine, up on the limestone shelves, capable of covering the road below from elevation. Caldwell himself was on the road, dismounted, standing with his horse at a casual angle that was the opposite of casual, the positioning of a man who wants to appear to be simply waiting while being entirely ready to move. They had not yet seen Daniel and Martha on the rise above, because Daniel had read the terrain and brought them up on the blind side of the eastern shelf, the side from which the road approached, the side you wouldn't watch because the threat, in Caldwell's thinking, was ahead rather than behind. Martha looked down at the 3 men and felt something settle in her chest that was not calm exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific settling of a person who has been afraid for a long time and has arrived at the moment the fear was pointing toward and finds in the arrival that the thing to do is simply be present for it. "He's going to stop whoever comes through here," she said quietly. "He doesn't need to hurt them. He just needs to turn them back or delay them long enough." "Long enough for what?" Daniel said, though she thought he already knew. "Long enough for Harlan to make his move while Hewitt's case is still incomplete." She looked at the positions of the 2 elevated men. If Aldrich comes through here with Francis Greer's agreement to testify, and Caldwell turns him back, or worse, the case loses its strongest element of established pattern. Harlan's lawyers can argue his behavior is isolated, exceptional, out of character. She paused. The falsified deed becomes harder to attach to him personally. Daniel was quiet, reading the terrain the way he always read it, the rotating scan moving over the ravine and its edges and the approach road and the sky and the whole picture at once. "I can get down the east side of the shelf without going through the road," he said. "Come out on the flat behind them, but it takes time and it means you're up here alone while I do it." "Go," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going to do anything foolish," she said. "I'm going to wait. Caldwell would recognize you." "I know. If he recognizes you, he's not going to assume you're here alone." "I know that too," she said. "Go." He went. She watched him angle bay down the east face of the shelf, moving carefully in the limestone debris, staying below the sight lines of the elevated men. He was very good at this, at becoming part of the landscape rather than a disturbance of it, at moving through terrain with the specific patience of someone who understands that being in a hurry is its own kind of visibility. Martha sat on smoke on the rise above the gap and waited. She watched Caldwell below her. He was still in his careful, casual posture, hands loose, pale hat marking him distinctly against the limestone. She thought about what Daniel had said, that he was a calculating man. She thought about what calculation looked like from the outside. It looked like patience, like stillness, like a man simply standing in a road. But inside it was nothing like stillness. Inside it was constant arithmetic, a sound from the east, the distant rhythmic sound of a single horse coming at a steady trot. Aldrich. Leaving for Council Bluffs 2 hours earlier than planned because Marsh had pushed the timing forward. Martha looked at the ravine. She looked at the 3 men who didn't know she was there. She looked at the road below and the way the geometry of the trap would close the moment the deputy rode into it. She made a decision. She rode down. She came down the face of the rise on the western side, in plain view, walking smoke deliberately. Not fast, not rushing, but deliberate in the specific way that communicates I know exactly where I am and why I am here. She came down onto the road and she rode toward the gap, and she did not stop until she was close enough that Caldwell looked up and saw her, and the calculation behind his eyes shifted from one configuration to another. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was the same voice she'd heard in the ravine 2 nights ago, flat and unhurried, designed to communicate that nothing was urgent, that nothing was beyond his management. But there was a quality beneath it now that hadn't been there before, a faint tightening, the voice of a man who has encountered a variable his calculation hadn't fully weighted. "Caldwell," she said. She was sitting straight in the saddle. The hip was burning, had been burning since the first mile out of Fort Carson, but she sat straight because the straightness was not for her. It was for him, and for the 2 men on the shelves above, and for whatever was coming down the road behind her. "You're a long way from Agnes Parker's boarding house," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am." He looked at her with that calculating steadiness. "This road is a public road," he said. "I'm not doing anything illegal standing here." "I know," she said. "Neither am I." A pause. The horses shifted slightly in the way horses do when their riders are holding still and the horses feel the tension of the stillness and don't understand it. "What is it you want, Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. His voice had the patience of a man with time and position on his side, or at least believing himself to have both. Martha looked at him. She had been trying, for the last 2 miles of riding, to find the precise center of what she wanted to say. Not the legal argument, which was Marsh's and Hewitt's territory. Not the personal grievance, which was too easily dismissed as emotion, but the specific, direct thing that needed to be said between 2 people in a road on a clear afternoon in Nebraska, one of whom had spent the last year doing things in the dark. "I want you to understand something," she said. Her voice shook slightly on the first word, just slightly, just the small physical tremor of a person who is afraid and is speaking anyway, and then steadied. "Not for my sake. For yours." She held his eyes. "The papers are in Fort Carson. The letters, the deed, the false prior claim your employer had manufactured. All of it is on a table in Caleb Marsh's possession right now. The judicial filing is being made today. Whatever happens on this road in the next 30 minutes, none of that changes." Caldwell was very still. "Harlan is going to answer for this," she said. "In a court of law, in front of a jury, with the full record of what he's done laid out in front of 12 people who will listen to the evidence and decide. That is going to happen, and every man who is working for him when it happens is going to be examined for his role in it." She paused. "You're a careful man. You've always been a careful man. That's your reputation. A careful man looks at what's in front of him and makes a rational decision about costs and benefits." She could hear the approaching horse now, clearer, closer. "The deputy coming down this road is carrying a legal document authorizing him to request testimony from a witness in Council Bluffs," she said. "That document was signed this morning by a district court judge. If you stop him, you're obstructing a court order. That's not a frontier matter. That's a federal matter." She held his gaze without wavering. "I don't believe you are a man who makes decisions that land him in federal trouble. Not for a client whose enterprise is already failing." The sound of the horse was close now. She could hear the rhythm of the trot, the specific cadence of an unloaded horse covering ground efficiently. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. She watched him doing it, watched the calculation running, watched the variables being weighted. He was looking at her face and looking at whatever was behind her and looking at the road and the ravine and the day and the whole configuration of the thing as it stood. Then, in the peripheral edge of her vision, she saw Daniel. He had come out from the eastern approach, behind Caldwell's position at the far end of the gap. He was on bay, stationary, positioned at the opening of the ravine with his rifle resting across his saddle in the relaxed but unambiguous manner of a man who has had this rifle ready for some time and wants this fact acknowledged without being theatrical about it. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Caldwell saw him. The calculation completed. The man on the right shelf began to move, a small movement, a weight shift, the beginning of something. Caldwell raised one hand without looking at him. The movement stopped. The Deputy Aldrich came around the western curve of the approach road and saw the assembled company in the road ahead of him and pulled up with the startled caution of a young man who has ridden into a situation he doesn't fully understand. He looked at Caldwell. He looked at Martha. He looked at Daniel at the far end of the gap. Martha turned in her saddle and looked at him. "Deputy Aldrich," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has earned it, "you have a document to deliver." Aldrich looked at her for a moment, then straightened in his saddle. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Then ride through." He looked at Caldwell. Caldwell stepped to the side of the road, not backward and not with submission. He stepped aside the way men step aside when they have made a rational decision and are choosing to frame it as something other than retreat. He moved his horse to the edge of the road, and he looked at Martha Whitmore with an expression that was composed and unreadable and carried beneath its composure the particular quality of a man who is filing something away for later consideration. Aldrich rode through the gap. The sound of his horse faded east. Martha held Caldwell's eyes for one more moment. She wanted him to understand. Not with triumph, not with the performance of victory, but with the simple, unadorned clarity of a woman who has been fighting this particular fight for 14 months and is not finished, that this was not an ending. It was a point in a longer story, and the longer story was going to reach a conclusion that he and his employer would not be satisfied with. She turned smoke and rode back toward Fort Carson. Hewitt was on the road before she'd covered half the distance back. He came fast, 2 deputies behind him, moving with the urgent efficiency of a man who has received information and is acting on it. He pulled up when he saw her coming, and his expression did a brief, complex thing that was part relief and part the carefully contained exasperation of a professional whose witness and the object of his protection has ridden into a confrontation without him. "Clara sent another message," he said. "Agnes's girl. Told me where you'd gone." "Smart girl," Martha said. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Caldwell?" "Is on a road east of the gap with 2 men who are very likely discussing whether their current employment arrangement remains advisable," she said. "I don't believe he'll make another move today, but I'd appreciate it if you sent someone to watch the road." Hewitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel, who had come up on her left. Then he looked back at her. "You rode out there and talked him down," he said. It was not quite a question. "I told him the truth," she said, "about the filing, about Marsh, about what he stood to lose." She paused. "Sometimes the truth is the most useful thing you have." "He let Aldrich through?" He stepped aside. Another long look from Hewitt. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "I have been in this job for 22 years. I have dealt with a considerable variety of difficult people in a considerable variety of difficult situations." He stopped. He seemed to be finding the specific words he wanted. "What you just did was either very brave or very reckless, and I haven't decided which." "My husband would have said it was both," Martha said. "He believed they weren't mutually exclusive." Something shifted in Hewitt's expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happens to a face when it has received something it didn't expect and found it accurate. He turned his horse and fell in beside her, and they rode back toward Fort Carson together in the afternoon light. That evening, Caldwell and his 2 men left Fort Carson. Pete Gruber reported it to Daniel at 6:30. The 3 horses gone from the livery, the bill settled in coin, no forwarding information, no questions asked of the hostler. Just 3 men riding out south as the light was going. Gruber delivered this information with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been keeping track of something and is now watching the tracking conclude in a satisfying direction. Daniel went to Agnes's house and told Martha. She received the news sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd been nursing for 20 minutes, and she set the cup down and was quiet for a moment. "He's going back to report," she said. "That would be my reading," Daniel agreed. "Which means Harlan knows the case is real, knows the filing is in process, knows that Caldwell couldn't stop it." She looked at the table. "What does a man like Harlan do when he knows he's losing?" "Depends on the man," Daniel said. "Some men double down, some men run." "Harlan's not a running man," Martha said. She said it with the certainty of someone who has spent 14 months studying a person's behavior closely enough to predict it. "He'll find another angle, another approach." She looked up. "He'll come himself." Agnes, at the stove said nothing, but the quality of her silence acknowledged the probability. Daniel sat down across the table from Martha. The kitchen was warm, the evening coming in soft through the window, the sounds of Fort Carson settling into its nighttime arrangements drifting in from the street. In the parlor, Mrs. Delaney could be heard humming something tuneless and pleasant. Clara's footsteps crossed the floor above them, back and forth, the specific rhythm of a young woman who is thinking by moving. "He comes himself," Daniel said. "Into a town where Hewitt has a formal investigation in process, where a district court judge has already signed a document, where Marsh is present with the full record of his fraud." He held Martha's look. "He walks into that himself, and he's not doubling down. He's surrendering. He may not see it that way. No, men like Harlan usually don't until they do." He was quiet for a moment. "But Hewitt will be ready." Martha looked at him. There was something she wanted to say, and she was deciding whether this was the right moment for it, whether the right moment would ever arrive, or whether the right moment was simply whenever you chose to say the thing. "I keep thinking about something," she said, "about the gap today, when I rode down there." She paused. "I wasn't sure what I was going to say until I started saying it. It just arranged itself in the writing. The words came from somewhere I didn't know I had them." "Thomas was in them," Daniel said simply. She looked at him. "The patience you said he had," he said. "The way he chose patience as a tool rather than a temperament. That's what you used today. You were patient with Caldwell. You gave him the information, and you let him do the arithmetic, and you gave him a way to step aside that wasn't defeat." He paused. "That's not something most people know how to do when they're afraid." Martha was quiet for a long moment. "I was afraid," she said. "I want to be clear about that. My hands were shaking when I rode down that hill. I was absolutely terrified." "I know," Daniel said. "I could see it from the shelf." "But," she stopped. "But there was something underneath the fear that was steadier, that had been getting steadier for the last 14 months, through all of it, through Thomas dying, and Harlan coming with his lawyer, and the letters, and the cut fences, and finally the storm, and the ride, and all of it." "Bien." She looked at her hands on the table, the healing palm, the bitten nails, the strong, work-roughened hands of a woman who had spent 33 years building something. "I think I know what it is," she said. "It's that I'm right. I know that with complete certainty. The ranch is mine. Thomas's intention is documented. The law is on my side, and I have been right for 14 months while someone tried to make me feel like I was wrong, tried to make me feel like my age and my grief and my being alone made me less capable of knowing what was true." She looked up. "But I know what's true. I've always known. And that knowing doesn't go away just because someone is persistent about disputing it." Agnes turned from the stove and looked at her. Something moved in her face. Recognition, depth of it. The specific recognition of someone who has heard their own experience articulated by another person in words they hadn't quite found themselves. "No," Agnes said quietly. "It doesn't." The three of them sat with that for a moment. The fire in the stove, the humming from the parlor, Clara's footsteps above. On the second day after this, a wire arrived from Hewitt's contact in Omaha. Harlan Cole had purchased a stage ticket to North Platte. He was coming. The wire sat on Hewitt's desk for exactly 4 minutes before he acted on it. Martha knew the timing because she had been sitting across from him when it arrived, going through a final review of Marsh's document sequence in preparation for the court filing, and she watched Hewitt read it, set it down, read it again, and then stand up with the particular economy of motion that she had come to recognize as his version of urgency. Controlled, directional, entirely without waste. "North Platte is 2 days by stage," he said. "He'd transfer to Fort Carson from there. Puts him here in 3 days, possibly 4 if the roads are still soft." He looked at Marsh. "How close are we?" Marsh had his spectacles on and a pen in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been doing arithmetic in his head since the wire was read aloud. "The fraud filing is complete and submitted," he said. "The district court has it. What we're waiting on is Aldrich's return from Council Bluffs with Francis Greer's deposition, which," he checked his watch, Given that he's been gone 3 days and the round trip is manageable in 4, should arrive tomorrow or the day after. Which is before Harlan gets here, Daniel said from the window. Assuming no delays, Marsh said in the careful tone of a lawyer who has learned never to assume no delays. What changes if Harlan arrives before the deposition does? Martha asked. Hewitt and Marsh exchanged the brief, loaded look of two professionals who have reached the same conclusion and are deciding who delivers it. Hewitt spoke. He arrives as a private citizen in a territory where a fraud investigation is in process against him, he said carefully. I can't arrest him on arrival. I need the court's authorization. Without the Greer deposition, the fraud case is strong, but not iron. His lawyers could argue the pattern of behavior isn't established sufficiently. They could request a delay of proceedings pending additional review. He paused. A delay of proceedings is not a defeat for us, but it gives Harlan time in the territory. Time to apply pressure through legal channels. He stopped. Time to find another angle, Martha finished. The phrase from 2 nights ago. She had known then what it meant, and she knew it now more precisely. He'll try to negotiate. He'll come here with an offer, some modified version of what he wanted, dressed up as a compromise designed to look reasonable to a court if she refuses it. He's done it before, Marsh said quietly. Everyone at the table looked at him. The Greer family, he said. Before they settled. Harlan came in person, showed up at their property with a lawyer and a revised offer, and presented it in front of witnesses so that when they refused it, the record showed he had tried to be reasonable. His voice was level, but the levelness had texture. The texture of long professional familiarity with the specific way that certain kinds of men construct their respectability. He's very good at the appearance of reasonableness. It's been his most effective tool. Martha sat with that for a moment. She thought about the funeral, Harlan arriving with a lawyer 11 hours after his father was in the ground, and the careful smile and the offer to help her manage things. She thought about the letters she had burned in the kitchen stove, each one more insistent than the last, but each one phrased just carefully enough to maintain the appearance of concern. She thought about the deed of transfer he had brought 3 weeks ago, and how he had called it for your own good, and how the phrase had been designed to sit in a court record and sound like something a dutiful son would say. The appearance of reasonableness. He can't negotiate what isn't his to offer, she said. Her voice was very steady. The ranch is mine, the will is filed, the law is clear. There is nothing to negotiate. She looked at Hewitt. When he arrives, whatever he brings, whatever he offers, whatever he says in front of witnesses, I want you there. I'll be there, Hewitt said. And Marsh. Of course, Marsh said. She looked at Daniel. He was still at the window, but his eyes were on her. She didn't ask him. She didn't need to. His presence was the answer. Then we wait for Aldrich, she said, and we are ready for whatever Harlan brings. Aldrich arrived the following afternoon, road dusty and slightly saddle-sore, and carrying a satchel with the careful attention of someone who has been told several times how important its contents are. He came directly to the marshal's office, where Hewitt, Marsh, and Martha were already assembled as though they had known the exact hour of his arrival, which, by that point, they had more or less calculated. He set the satchel on the desk and opened it and produced a document of 7 pages, handwritten in a clear and careful script that was not Aldrich's. It was Frances Greer's hand, or rather the hand of the notary who had taken her spoken testimony and recorded it with the formal precision that a legal deposition requires. Marsh picked it up and read it in silence. The room waited. He read it twice. On the second reading, about halfway through, something changed in his expression. A small change, the kind you would miss if you were not watching for it. A slight relaxation around the eyes that, in Caleb Marsh, who held himself with the professional composure of a man who has learned to reveal nothing prematurely, was the equivalent of anyone else's visible relief. He set it down. Frances Greer, he said, testifies that in the winter of 1872, Harlan Cole approached her late husband with a proposal to purchase their property, a farm of 200 acres outside Omaha, at a price she characterizes as significantly below market value. When her husband declined, the approaches escalated over a period of 6 months to include deliberate damage to the property's water supply, interference with their hired hands, and a direct physical threat made in the presence of two witnesses, both of whom she names. He paused. She further testifies that when the family agreed to settle, which they did under duress, she states explicitly, the settlement included a confidentiality clause that she was told was standard and was not told, at the time, was specifically designed to prevent her from speaking about the method of acquisition. He looked up over his spectacles. She says she understands that clause may have been legally binding. She says she has spoken with an attorney in Council Bluffs who advises her that the clause cannot prevent her from providing testimony in a criminal fraud proceeding. Another pause. She says she has been waiting for someone to ask. The room was very quiet. Martha thought about Frances Greer in Council Bluffs, a woman she had never met, the daughter of a family that had been through what she herself was in the middle of, who had settled and been silenced and then sat with that silence for 3 years waiting for someone to ask. The specific loneliness of that, the specific anger. "Can we use it?" she asked. "We can use all of it," Marsh said. The named witnesses from the 1872 incident can be subpoenaed if they're locatable. The confidentiality clause, her attorney is right, it can't prevent criminal testimony. And the pattern it establishes. He set the document down on top of the other documents, the full accumulated record of Harlan Cole's architecture of fraud. The pattern is unambiguous. This is not a man who made a single bad decision under financial pressure. This is a man with a method. Hewitt picked up the deposition and read through it himself more quickly, in the scanning way of someone confirming rather than discovering. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Martha. "I'm filing for an arrest warrant this afternoon," he said. "With this, combined with what Marsh has, and the falsified deed, and your husband's letters, the district court will grant it." He paused. "When Harlan arrives, I'll be at the stage depot." "How long until the warrant is issued?" Daniel asked. "Today or tomorrow. Judge Calloway is efficient, and he's already seen the fraud filing. This completes it." He looked at Marsh. "You'll need to sign as co-petitioner." "Already prepared for it," Marsh said, patting the satchel. Martha looked at the pile of documents on Hewitt's desk. The deed, the will, the letters, Marsh's correspondence, the falsified Breck deed, and now Frances Greer's 7 pages of quiet, careful, long-delayed truth, and thought about the year it had taken to assemble them. Not just the last 2 weeks of running and riding and waiting. The whole year. Thomas's careful recording over decades. Marsh's quiet investigation. Agnes's boarding house standing open in Fort Carson. Frances Greer waiting in Council Bluffs with her 3 years of silence and her willingness to end it. All of it had been accumulating the way a river accumulates, from many sources, each one insufficient alone, together becoming something that could move things. "When this is over," she said, to no one in particular and all of them at once, "I want to write to Frances Greer." Nobody asked why. They all understood. Harlan Cole arrived on a Thursday, 3 days later, on the afternoon stage from North Platte. He arrived well-dressed, as he always was, in a dark coat and clean boots, and the specific groomed composure of a man who has prepared himself to be seen. He had a lawyer with him, a different lawyer than the one he'd brought to the ranch, younger and sharper-faced, with the particular confident energy of someone who has been hired for a confrontation and is ready for it. He had a single travel bag, which suggested he intended to resolve matters quickly and return. He stepped off the stage onto the main street of Fort Carson and adjusted his hat and looked at the street with the assessing expression of a man arriving to conduct business. He did not expect Hewitt. The marshal was standing on the depot platform with Deputy Aldrich and Deputy Carson flanking him, and with Caleb Marsh standing slightly to the side in the way of someone whose role is formal witness rather than enforcement, but who is entirely present and entirely attentive. Hewitt was holding a document. Harlan saw them and was still for exactly 1 second. 1 second in which his expression underwent a rapid internal reorganization, the calculation running its numbers so fast it was almost invisible, arriving in that single second at an assessment of the situation and a strategy for it. Then he smiled and walked forward. "Marshal," he said. His voice was warm, genuinely warm, which was the thing about him that was hardest to argue with. The warmth was real in the sense that it was practiced to the point of authenticity, deployed so naturally that it arrived as feeling rather than performance. "I've been looking forward to speaking with you," I'm glad you're here. Mr. Cole, Hewitt said. He held out the document. This is an arrest warrant issued this morning by District Court Judge Calloway for charges of fraud, forgery, attempted coercion, and conspiracy to deprive a property owner of her legal holdings. I'm asking you to come with me. Harlan's smile remained in place. It was a remarkable smile, Martha would think later. It could hold itself intact against things that should have dissolved it. He took the warrant and read it with the attention of someone who has read legal documents his entire life and knows exactly what to look for. His lawyer appeared at his elbow and read it simultaneously, and the lawyer's expression was less controlled, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth that acknowledged more than it intended to. This is procedurally premature, the lawyer said. His voice was precise and quick. My client has not been given the opportunity to respond to allegations. A warrant at this stage The warrant was granted by a district court judge on the basis of a complete evidentiary record, Marsh said from his position to the side, with the calm specificity of someone who assembled that record himself, including documentary evidence of fraud, a falsified deed currently in the court's possession, 4 decades of correspondence from the deceased property owner, and a sworn deposition from Francis Greer of Council Bluffs, whose testimony establishes a pattern of behavior predating the current matter by 3 years. The lawyer's expression did another involuntary thing. Harlan read to the bottom of the warrant and handed it back to Hewitt. He was quiet for a moment. The street was not empty. A Thursday afternoon in Fort Carson had its regular traffic. People on errands and business, and several of them had slowed or stopped with the careful, not quite watching attention of people in a small town who understand that something important is happening 20 feet from them. Harlan seemed to register this audience, seemed to calculate its presence as a factor. I came here in good faith, he said. His voice was still warm, but the warmth had a new layer now, a layer of something directed at the watching street as much as at Hewitt. I came here to discuss a resolution that would be fair to everyone. I want to be on the record as saying that I've always wanted a fair resolution. You're on the record, Marsh said. As of this moment, everything said in the presence of these witnesses is part of the legal record. A pause. Including that statement. Harlan looked at Marsh. Something passed between them. The specific look of 2 men who have been dealing with each other through documents and intermediaries and are now in the same physical space for the first time, and each recognizes in the other the shape of the opposing architecture. Marsh's expression did not change. His eyes held Harlan's with the steady patience of a man who has spent his career building cases that last and knows what one looks like. Harlan turned back to Hewitt. Am I being arrested, he said, or asked to come in for questioning? Arrested, Hewitt said. Another silence. The lawyer touched Harlan's elbow and leaned in and said something in a low voice, and Harlan listened without looking at him, his eyes somewhere in the middle distance of the Fort Carson Main Street, doing the last calculation. The one where you weight everything that's happened against everything that's still possible and arrive at the number that tells you what your options actually are, stripped of what you wish they were. He handed his travel bag to his lawyer and held out his wrists. Hewitt cuffed him with the businesslike efficiency of a man who has done this many times and finds no satisfaction in the theater of it, just the fact, just the completion of a necessary process. He walked Harlan Cole down the main street of Fort Carson toward the marshal's office, and Deputy Aldrich fell in behind, and the watching people on the street watched without comment, with the particular silence of a community that has seen things like this before and understands that silence is the appropriate witness. Martha was not at the depot. Hewitt had asked her not to be, had said, with the directness she had come to appreciate in him, that her presence at the arrest would be used by Harlan's lawyer to characterize the proceeding as personal rather than judicial, and that the colder the initial arrest appeared on the record, the cleaner the case would be. She had understood, and she had agreed, and she had sat in Agnes's parlor with her hands in her lap and a cup of tea she didn't drink and waited. Clara sat with her, not talking, not hovering, just present, in the way that Martha had been present for Clara in the past week, the simple physical solidarity of one person accompanying another through a hard wait. Agnes came in from the street at 4:15 with the news in her face before she said a word. He's in custody, she said. Martha closed her eyes. Not dramatically. Just for a moment, a single moment of something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, and was something she didn't have a clean name for. The specific feeling of a thing that has been suspended for a very long time, finally, irrevocably coming to ground. "All right," she said. She opened her eyes. "What happens now?" Agnes sat down across from her. "Hewitt will hold him pending the district court's scheduling. Marsh says a hearing date will be set within the week. The actual trial—" She paused. "Marsh says 2 to 3 weeks, given the strength of the evidence and the judge's schedule. Possibly less if Harlan's lawyer decides to negotiate rather than contest." "He'll contest," Martha said with certainty. "It's not in his nature to negotiate when he thinks he can win." "Can he win?" Martha thought about the pile of documents, Thomas's letters, Marsh's correspondence, Francis Greer's 7 careful pages, the falsified deed with its invented man, the whole accumulated record of what had been done and how and when and by whom. "No," she said, "he can't." She said it not as hope and not as defiance. She said it the way you state a fact that has been verified, with the flat, final weight of something that has been checked and found to be true. The days that followed had a different texture than the days that had preceded them. The tension that had underlain everything since the night of the storm. The constant, low-frequency awareness of threat, of men watching from ridgelines, of a hostile calculation running somewhere in the background of every moment, began to lift. Not all at once, not completely, but perceptibly. The way pressure lifts from a room when a window is opened. Martha felt it in the quality of her sleep, which deepened. She felt it in the hip, which had not improved medically, but which she was moving through with less of the particular grimness of someone who is overriding pain for a reason they cannot yet afford to stop for. She felt it in the way she ate breakfast in Agnes's kitchen in the mornings, which became something she was present for rather than something she was getting through. Harlan's lawyer filed 2 motions in the first week, both of which the court denied with the efficient brevity of a judge who has read the evidence and found the motions without sufficient foundation. The second denial came with a note from Judge Calloway that Marsh described with the understated satisfaction of a careful man as unusually direct. He did not share the note's precise language, but his expression when he read it suggested it was not gentle. Daniel stayed. He had not announced this, had not made a declaration or an explanation. He had simply continued to be present in the specific, undemonstrative way that was his nature, occupying his room at the boarding house and taking his meals with the household and maintaining the quiet peripheral watch that had become, over the past 2 weeks, simply part of the life of Agnes Parker's establishment. Pete Gruber at the livery had apparently decided Daniel was a fixture, greeting him each morning with the comfortable informality of long habit. Martha noticed. She didn't comment on it for several days, respecting the specific silence that surrounded his presence, the way you respect the silence around a decision someone has made and has not finished making. But on the 5th day after Harlan's arrest, sitting on the back steps in the evening as had become their habit, she said simply, "You're still here." "Yes," he said. "You have a route," she said, not accusingly, just noting. "Ranches that need work, obligations. I sent word to the Jessup place, and the Harmon Ranch on the Cedar Creek line." He looked at the darkening sky. "They'll manage." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of not knowing, but the quiet of finding the precise words for something that had been clear to him without language for some time. "Because this isn't finished," he said at last. "The arrest is done. The court is coming. But He paused. "The thing you're in the middle of. It doesn't end with the arrest. There's the trial, and then there's whatever comes after the trial, and—" He stopped again. Martha looked at him steadily. "And?" she said. He looked at her with the direct, undefended look that she had first seen in the doorway of the Jessup cabin, when he had stepped aside and said, "The choice is yours," and meant it the way very few people mean things. "And I don't want to ride out before I know how it goes," he said. It was the most he had said about himself in 2 weeks, and it sat there between them with the particular weight of honesty that is also vulnerability. The specific quality of something said by a person who is accustomed to keeping their own counsel and has decided deliberately to extend an exception. Martha looked at the sky for a moment, A nighthawk was working the air above the cottonwoods at the end of the alley, banking and diving in the blue dusk, catching things too small to see from below. Thomas used to say, she said, that the hardest thing about getting older was learning which things to hold on to and which things to let the current take. She watched the nighthawk. I've been letting a lot go in the last year. The idea of running the ranch alone indefinitely. The idea that Harlan would simply go away if I was firm enough. The idea that I could do all of it without ever needing anyone. She paused. I'm still learning the other side of it. What to hold on to. Daniel said nothing, which was not the same as having nothing to say. I'm glad you're still here, she said, simply, directly, in the way she had said things her whole life when the thing was true and needed saying. Good, he said, equally simply. And they sat there as the nighthawk worked and the stars came out, and the alley filled slowly with the comfortable dark of a summer evening in a town where, for the first time in over a year, nobody was watching from the ridgeline. The trial began on a Tuesday, 2.5 weeks after the arrest. It was held in the Fort Carson courthouse, a single-room building of solid construction that smelled of pine and old paper and the specific dry mustiness of official proceedings. Judge Calloway presided, a gray-haired, deliberate man of 60, with the patient authority of someone who has heard a great deal of human argument and has long since ceased to be surprised by the creative variety of human wrongdoing, though he remained evidently capable of being displeased by it. The gallery was full. Fort Carson was not a large town, and a fraud and coercion trial involving a land dispute of this magnitude was the kind of event that drew people not out of prurience, but out of the specific civic interest that communities develop in matters that touch on the fundamental questions of who owns what and whether the law can be trusted to say so cleanly. Farmers and merchants and their wives sat in the gallery with the attentive stillness of people who understand that the answer matters to them personally. Martha sat at the table with Marsh and Hewitt to her right. Across the aisle, Harlan sat with his lawyer, dressed immaculately, composed in the way he was always composed, that surface of warm reasonableness maintained against everything. He did not look at Martha when she came in. She looked at him once, directly, to take his measure in this specific room and this specific circumstance, and then she looked forward and did not look at him again. Daniel sat in the gallery's first row, directly behind her. The opening statements took the better part of the first morning. Harlan's lawyer presented the case with the technical competence of someone who has been handed a difficult brief and has decided the best strategy is aggressive procedure, challenging the chain of custody of the evidence, questioning the reliability of Thomas Whitmore's letters as contemporaneous documents, suggesting that Francis Greer's testimony was motivated by a personal grievance rather than factual accuracy, arguing that the prior deed, while imperfect in its provenance, reflected a legitimate historical claim that had simply not been properly documented. It was a technically capable argument. Martha listened to it and felt the professional appreciation of someone who can recognize craftsmanship even in something deployed against her. And then she felt the bedrock certainty that had been growing in her for 14 months and reminded herself of the pile of documents and of Thomas's handwriting and of Francis Greer's 7 pages and of the word falsified delivered by Caleb Marsh with the full weight of 30 years of careful professional judgment behind it. Marsh's opening was shorter. He laid out the evidence sequence with the structural clarity of a man who has built the thing himself and knows where every joint is. He did not perform. He did not appeal. He simply described what the document showed in the order in which they showed it, and let the accumulated weight of the record speak in the way that records do when they are complete and honest and have been built by a man who recorded things carefully for 33 years, because that was simply his nature. The trial ran 4 days. They were 4 days of testimony and counter-testimony, of documents presented and examined and argued over, of the specific legal theater that is at once profoundly boring in its procedure and profoundly tense in its content. Marsh testified on the 3rd day for 3 hours, going through the evidence sequence with the same architectural precision he had used in his opening, answering the cross-examination with the patient specificity of a man who has anticipated every question and documented his answer to it. Francis Greer's deposition was read aloud by Aldrich on the 4th day. He read it in the clear, neutral voice of someone rendering service to the document rather than interpretation, and the 7 pages filled the courtroom with the quiet, specific weight of a woman's truth, the water supply, the hired hands, the direct physical threat in the presence of witnesses, the confidentiality clause she had not understood at the time, the 3 years of silence, and the decision to end it. When Aldrich finished reading, the gallery was very still. Martha looked at her hands in her lap and thought about Francis Greer and the long wait in Council Bluffs, and felt something she could only describe as kinship across distance. The kinship of women who have been told, in different ways and in different circumstances, that their knowledge of what is true does not constitute reliable evidence, and who have turned out to be right anyway. On the fourth afternoon, both sides made their closing arguments. Harlan's lawyer went long and technical. He challenged individual links in the evidentiary chain with the persistence of someone who hopes that if enough links are questioned, the chain's overall strength will be doubted. He returned repeatedly to the theme of reasonable interpretation, that what Marsh characterized as fraud might reasonably be interpreted as aggressive but legal business practice, that what Francis Greer described might reasonably be understood as a contentious negotiation rather than coercion, that the letters from Thomas Whitmore, while consistent with Marsh's reading, might reasonably be read differently. Reasonably. The word appeared in his closing argument 14 times. Martha counted. Marsh's closing was 7 minutes long. He said that the evidence did not require interpretation. It required reading. That Thomas Whitmore had documented what happened, that Francis Greer had documented what happened, that the falsified deed bearing the signature of a man who did not exist, in connection with a property claim that no record supported, was not a matter of reasonable interpretation, but a matter of material fact. That the jury had been presented with a complete record of a man who had, over a period of years, attempted to take what did not belong to him through means that the law described precisely and unambiguously as fraud. He sat down. Judge Calloway gave his instructions to the jury in the measured, careful tone of a man who trusts the process enough to deliver it simply and step back from it. The jury retired at 4:15 on the fourth afternoon. They returned at 7:40 the following morning. Martha was in the courthouse when the foreman stood up. She was sitting straight, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her eyes on the foreman's face. Beside her, Marsh was still, with the peculiar calm of someone who has done everything he can do and has accepted that the next moment is not in his hands. Behind her in the gallery, she heard Daniel's particular quality of silence, the silence that was not absence but presence, the specific attending weight of someone who is entirely there. The foreman was a farmer named Aldous, not Aldous Breck, who did not exist, but Aldous Teal, who ran cattle 12 miles east of Fort Carson, and who had the honest, sun-weathered face of someone accustomed to calling things what they were. On the charge of fraud, he said, "We find the defendant guilty." A sound moved through the gallery. Not a sound of triumph, more the sound of something settling, of weight finding its proper distribution. On the charge of forgery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted coercion, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive a property owner of her legal holdings, he paused, just a fraction of a second, and then, guilty. Martha sat very still. She heard Harlan's lawyer begin an immediate procedural objection and heard Judge Calloway's measured dismissal of it. She heard the gallery's low murmur and the sound of the gavel. She heard Marsh beside her exhale once, just once, with the controlled precision of a man releasing something carefully. She heard none of it with any part of herself that was fully present, because the part of herself that was fully present was in a different place entirely, was in the south pasture, on a cold March morning, in the mud, holding a man's face in her hands. Was in a kitchen in Ohio, 33 years ago, looking across a table at a man she had just decided to trust. Was on a gray horse in a storm, bleeding hands on the reins, riding toward a single light in the cottonwood trees. Thomas had built something worth protecting. She had protected it. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up. Daniel was standing behind her. He had moved from the gallery and was standing at her shoulder with his hand resting on it. Not pressing, not dramatic, just there, in the simple physical language of someone who knows that some moments need a witness and is willing to be one. She put her hand over his. They stayed like that while the courthouse arranged itself around the verdict, while Judge Calloway made his notes, and the clerk made his records, and Harlan's lawyer made his futile objections. And the gallery began the process of becoming ordinary people again, leaving by the door they had come in, carrying the morning's events back into the regular world. Outside, she knew, it was a clear day. The kind of clear that Nebraska produces in summer after the storms have passed. Absolute, blue, enormous, the sky so high and clean, it looks like something that has been worked on. Later, on the courthouse steps, Marsh told her that the conviction carried a sentence that would remove Harlan from any legal ability to contest the property for the rest of his natural life. His assets were subject to seizure and partial restitution. His influence, the network of lawyers and business contacts that had made him capable of mounting this particular campaign, was effectively destroyed. People did not, as a rule, continue working with men who had been publicly convicted of fraud and forgery in a district court. "It's over," Marsh said. He said it not as celebration, but as verification, the same tone he used when confirming that a document was in order. Martha looked at the Fort Carson Main Street, at the ordinary Thursday morning life of a small prairie town going about its business in the clear summer air. "Yes," she said. And then, after a moment, because the word was true and needed saying, "Finally." The word finally hung in the Fort Carson air for a moment, and then dissolved into the ordinary sounds of the street. A wagon passing, a screen door somewhere, the distant clang of the smithy that had been the first sound she'd heard every morning for 2 weeks. And Martha Whitmore stood on the courthouse steps and let the world continue being itself around her while she took the full measure of what had just happened. Marsh shook her hand with both of his, which was as demonstrative as she had ever seen him, and told her he would begin the formal restoration paperwork the following morning and have the legal title confirmation back in her name with the county recorder within the week. He said this with the professional satisfaction of a man who has built something that held weight and is watching it hold, and then he put on his hat and walked back toward the hotel where he had been staying, his battered satchel under his arm, lighter than it had been in days. Hewitt came out of the courthouse behind them and stood beside Martha for a moment on the steps, looking at the street. He said nothing for a while. Then, "Thomas Whitmore was a careful man." "Yes," she said. "He built you a good case," Hewitt said, "long before he knew you'd need it." She thought about that, about the decades of letters and the copies sent to Marsh, and the winter letter written against the possibility of not recovering, and the careful, thorough, unspectacular habit of documentation that had been simply how Thomas moved through the world. He had not known he was building a case. He had simply been the kind of man who wrote things down because the truth deserved to be recorded, because what had happened mattered, because a life was worth the effort of accuracy. "He did," she said. Hewitt nodded and went back inside, because there was still paperwork and still a convicted man in his custody, and the work of a marshal does not pause for courthouse steps and morning air. She appreciated that about him, the way he didn't linger in moments, the way he returned to the next necessary thing without ceremony. Daniel was standing at the bottom of the steps. He had his hat in his hands and Bay was tied at the post behind him, and the morning light was doing what Nebraska morning light does in late summer, coming in sideways and gold and long, laying itself across everything with the specific generosity of a season that knows it is running out of days. He looked up at her as she came down the steps, and his expression had the particular quality it had carried since the night of the storm, the quality of a man who is entirely present, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most things. "How do you feel?" he asked. She reached the bottom step and stood level with him and thought about the question honestly. "Strange," she said. "I thought I would feel more, or differently, but it's mostly quiet. Like after a long storm when the rain finally stops and you stand in it and it's just quiet." "That's what it is," he said simply. They walked together back toward Agnes's boarding house through the main street of Fort Carson in the clear morning, and people they passed acknowledged them. The hotel clerk nodding from the doorway, Pete Gruber raising a hand from the livery gate, a woman whose name Martha didn't know, but whose face she recognized from the gallery giving her a look that contained something warm and unambiguous. The town knew. Small towns always know before the official word arrives, and this one had been watching for 4 days and had drawn its own conclusions. And those conclusions were written in the way people looked at her as she walked the street on that Thursday morning in August of 1875. She walked through it without performance, without the stiffness of self-consciousness. Just walked, with her particular upright carriage and her healing hand and her hip that still burned and the specific grounded weight of a woman who has come through something and arrived on the other side of it still herself. Diminished in some ways, the crossing always diminishes, enlarged in others that she was only beginning to take the measure of. The formal paperwork took 4 days. During those 4 days, Harlan Cole was transferred to the county jail in North Platte pending sentencing, and the Fort Carson courthouse processed the reversal of every fraudulent document his lawyers had attempted to file in the preceding year, voiding them with the same clean bureaucratic efficiency with which they had originally been submitted, only in the opposite direction and with considerably more finality. Marsh stayed to oversee this process personally, which was not strictly necessary. The machinery of the court could have operated without him, but which was his way of ensuring that nothing was left imprecise or contingent, that the restoration of Martha's title was complete in every particular, leaving no ambiguity that a future lawyer might locate and exploit. On the 3rd day, a letter arrived at Agnes's boarding house addressed to Martha. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, a clear, careful script that she studied for a moment before opening. It was from Francis Greer. Francis had written it before receiving Martha's own letter, which was still in transit. Had written it, she explained, because Deputy Aldrich had been kind enough to tell her the outcome of the proceedings when he came to Council Bluffs, and because she had been waiting to hear that outcome with more investment than she had admitted to anyone. The letter was 2 pages long and written with the directness of a woman who has spent 3 years with too many unspoken things and has decided that the time for that is finished. She wrote that she was glad. She wrote that when her husband had settled all those years ago, she had understood intellectually that he had made the only choice available to a man with a family to protect and no resources to sustain a long legal fight, but that she had never been able to make her peace with the silence the settlement required, that some truths resist being put away quietly, regardless of how much you need them to. She wrote that testifying, even in the form of a deposition read aloud by a deputy she'd never meet, had been the first time in 3 years she had felt like herself again. She wrote, at the bottom of the 2nd page, in a sentence that Martha read 3 times, "I hope you will not go back to the ranch and be alone there with your victory. I hope you will do something with it that makes the winning mean more than just the winning." Martha folded the letter carefully and sat with it for a long while. Agnes found her there an hour later and sat down without asking what she was reading and without asking what she was thinking, which was the specific gift Agnes Parker gave to people, the gift of being present without requiring explanation. "She says I should do something with it," Martha said finally, "something that makes the winning mean more." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what that would be?" Martha looked around the parlor, at the room that had been her safe harbor for 2 weeks, at the walls that had held her while the case was built, and the days passed and the trial ran its course, at Clara's sewing basket in the corner, at Mrs. Delaney's chair by the fire, at the worn spot on the braided rug where Agnes herself stood every morning at the window with her coffee, reading the street, thinking about whatever Agnes Parker thought about at that hour. "I've been thinking about the ranch," Martha said slowly. "About whether to go back." Agnes waited. "Thomas and I built it together," she said. "It was ours. But it was ours for 33 years, and now it's mine alone, and—" She stopped. "I'm 65 years old. I rode 40 miles in a storm to keep it, and now that I can keep it, I keep finding myself asking whether that's what I should do with it." She looked at the letter in her hands. "Whether the victory is the keeping, or whether the victory is the having won the right to choose." Agnes looked at her for a long time. "Those are different things," she said. "Yes," Martha said. "They are." The difference had been forming in her for days, taking shape quietly, the way decisions take shape when they're the right ones, not arriving with drama but accumulating with the steady inevitability of water finding its level. She had been circling it without quite looking at it directly, and now she looked at it directly, and it was what she had known it was. She did not want to go back to the double W alone. Not because the ranch had been taken from her, not because Harlan had succeeded in making it something other than her home. He hadn't, the verdict had made that clear, But because she had discovered, in 2 weeks in Agnes Parker's white boarding house, something about what life could look like when it was lived in the company of people who needed each other and said so. Clara with her school teacher mother's handwriting and her 6 months of figuring out what came next. Mrs. Delaney in her armchair. Ruth at the dry goods store. Agnes herself, with her particular quality of receiving people exactly as they arrived and giving them the room to become who they were going to be next. She had been alone in the Double W for 14 months, and she had survived it and fought from inside it and never once considered anything other than the absolute necessity of keeping it. But now, on the other side of the keeping, she understood that what she had been fighting for was not the land itself. It was the right to decide. The right that Thomas had ensured for her in his careful documentation and his filed will and his 33 years of treating her like someone whose judgment was sound. The right to choose. And she was choosing. She told Daniel first. They were on the back steps in the evening, as had become the place where the important things were said between them. The alley behind Agnes's house having acquired over 2 weeks the specific weight of a location that has been the site of honest conversation. She told him she was going to sell the ranch. He received this without surprise, which told her he had been watching the shape of her thinking and had arrived somewhere near the same conclusion before she said it aloud. "To whom?" he asked. "Ingrid Maki," she said. "My neighbor to the east. She's been alone since her husband died 3 years ago, working 200 acres with her oldest son and without enough land to make it fully sustainable. The Double W would give her the river access she needs." She paused. Thomas respected her. He would have approved of her having it. "What will you do with the money?" She looked at the alley wall, at the gap in the boards where the light came through in the afternoon, at the nighthawk she had been watching work the air above the cottonwoods every evening for 2 weeks. "Agnes needs to expand," she said. "This house is full. Clara sleeps in the small room that was a storage closet. There are women who come to Fort Carson needing somewhere to go, and sometimes there's no room." She paused. "I've been thinking about the building next door. It's been vacant for a year. The roof needs work, the foundation needs shoring up, but the bones are solid. With what the Double W would bring..." She stopped. It would be enough. More than enough. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "You'd stay here." "I'd stay here," she said, "if Agnes will have me." "Have you asked her?" "Not yet." She looked at him. "I wanted to say it out loud to someone I trusted first, to hear whether it sounded like the right thing or whether it sounded like a woman who's tired and is finding reasons to stop." He held her eyes for a moment, that steady, unhurried look. "It sounds like a woman who's figured out what the winning was for," he said. She held that for a moment. Francis Greer's letter in its neat fold on the parlor table. Thomas's winter letter in Marcia's careful satchel. The specific sentence, "I hope you will do something with it that makes the winning mean more than just the winning." "Yes," she said. "That's what it sounds like to me, too." She asked Agnes that evening after supper, while Clara and Ruth were clearing the table and Mrs. Delaney had fallen asleep in her chair in the parlor with the comfortable ease of a woman who has decided that sleep is her prerogative at whatever hour it arrives. Agnes listened with her coffee cup in both hands and her eyes on Martha's face with the full, unguarded attention she gave to things that mattered. She didn't interrupt. When Martha finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The building next door," she said. "I've looked at it from the street," Martha said. "I'll need to walk through it, talk to whoever holds the deed. But from the outside..." "I know who holds the deed," Agnes said. "Harlan Jessup. Not a relation of your cabin Jessup. Different family. He's been trying to sell it for 8 months. A pause. "The roof is the main problem. Foundation is better than it looks from the street." She set down her coffee. "How many women?" 6 more, at a minimum. Properly furnished, with a shared kitchen and a yard. 8, perhaps 10. Agnes looked at her with the specific expression of someone receiving a gift and trying to determine whether the dimensions of it are real. "Martha," she said. "I know what I'm offering," Martha said, "and I know what I'm asking in return." "What are you asking?" "A room of my own," she said, "and something to do with my days that matters." She paused. I was a rancher's wife for 33 years. I know how to manage a property, keep accounts, feed large numbers of people, negotiate with suppliers, and make decisions under pressure. She looked at Agnes directly. You need a partner, not a boarder. A partner. The kitchen was quiet. From the parlor came the soft sound of Mrs. Delaney's breathing. In the street outside, Fort Carson was going about its evening. Agnes Parker looked at Martha Whitmore for a long moment. She looked at the 65-year-old woman with the clear blue eyes and the healing palm and the specific unbreakable quality that had arrived at her door 2 weeks ago, soaking wet and bleeding and afraid, and had ridden 40 miles in a storm and talked down a hired enforcer in a ravine and sat through 4 days of trial with her hands folded and waited for 12 people to decide what she had known all along. Yes, Agnes said. Just that, just the single word, flat and certain, the way Agnes said things when they were decided. Martha nodded once. Good. And they finished their coffee. The letter to Ingrid Mackey went out on the Friday stage. Martha wrote it herself, in the clear and careful hand she had developed over a lifetime of keeping the Double W's accounts. And she wrote it with the specific directness that the situation deserved. Not hedging, not softening, not presenting the offer as anything other than what it was. She wrote that the ranch was hers to sell, that the legal situation had been resolved completely and irrevocably, that the title was clean, and that she was offering Ingrid Mackey first right of purchase at a fair price set by the county assessor's most recent valuation with a 10% reduction as a mark of respect for 20 years of neighborly good faith. She wrote that Thomas had respected Ingrid and that she believed Thomas would have wanted the land to go to someone who would work it honestly and live in it with the specific grounded investment that good land deserves from the people who hold it. She wrote that the matter was entirely Ingrid's to decide and that she would not press, but that she wanted to offer before she offered elsewhere. She folded the letter and addressed it and gave it to Aldrich to add to the outgoing mail with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. The reply came back in 9 days. Ingrid Mackey wrote in the slightly formal English of a woman who had learned the language as an adult from a mother who had learned it first. Careful, precise, occasionally reaching for a phrase and finding a slightly formal version of it that conveyed the meaning with extra weight. She wrote that she had read the letter twice and then gone out to her north pasture and stood there looking at the river and thought about what Thomas Whitmore had built in 33 years on the land just west of her own, and about what Martha had held on to through the years since his death, and about what it meant to be offered something by a woman who had fought that hard to keep it. She wrote that yes, she wrote it in the center of the page, alone on its own line, underscored once. She wrote that she would have the money arranged within the month, and that she would come to Fort Carson herself to sign whatever needed signing, and that she would take good care of it, and that she thought Thomas would be pleased. Martha read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Agnes across from her and Daniel leaning in the doorway with his coffee, and when she finished reading, she set it down and looked at it for a moment, and then looked out the window at the Fort Carson street in the late summer morning light. "It's done," she said. Not sadly. Not with a specific grief of loss, though the grief was there. It would always be there, woven into the grain of the thing, inseparable from 33 years of a life. But underneath the grief was something else, something she recognized because she had been growing it for 2 weeks without fully acknowledging it. The specific lightness of a person who has set down something very heavy that they have been carrying for a long time, and who finds, in the setting down, not emptiness, but room. Room for what came next. The purchase of the building next door took 3 weeks to negotiate, during which time Martha proved herself to be precisely the kind of businesswoman she had described to Agnes. Direct, prepared, and entirely unintimidated by Harlan Jessup's initial asking price, which she countered with a detailed itemization of the roof and foundation work required, the 8 months of vacant carrying costs, and the current state of the Fort Carson property market, delivered with the calm specificity of someone who has been keeping accounts and making decisions for 3 decades and did not arrive at this table without doing the arithmetic. Jessup, who had been expecting the gentle negotiation of a woman seeking a favor, encountered instead a woman who knew the numbers better than he did and was not performing confidence but simply having it. He came down 15% on the second offer and she took it and they shook hands over Marsh's desk. Marsh, who was still in Fort Carson completing the Double W title work, served as the transactions notary with the expression of a man who is professionally obligated to remain neutral and is finding this moderately challenging. The building next door had good bones, as Agnes had said. The roof was a week's work for 3 men and the foundation needed pointing in 2 places but was otherwise sound. The interior was a single large floor with 6 rooms, a kitchen space, and a back room that could serve as a shared parlor. Martha walked through it the day after the purchase, Agnes beside her, both of them moving through the empty rooms with the specific dual vision of people who can see what is and what will be simultaneously. 6 rooms, Agnes said. 7 if we partition the back room, Martha said. Leave the parlor space on the ground floor, put the 7th room above it. That's a carpenter's job. I know a carpenter, Martha said. Pete Gruber at the livery had a brother-in-law. She had established this in week 1 of her Fort Carson residence and had been filing it away as information that would eventually be useful. Agnes looked at her sideways. You know a carpenter? I know a carpenter, Martha confirmed. Agnes shook her head slowly, but the head shaking had the specific quality of amusement rather than objection. 2 weeks you've been here, she said. I was paying attention, Martha said simply. The renovation took 6 weeks. Martha managed it with the same systematic competence she had applied to the Double W's operations for 33 years, and the carpenter, whose name was Elliot Gruber, and who turned out to be as reliable as his brother-in-law had suggested, did work that was solid and honest and completed on the schedule they had agreed, which Martha had learned over the years was the single most reliable indicator of a craftsman's character. Clara helped with the furnishing. She had an eye for it that surprised Martha initially and then didn't, because, of course, a woman who had been raised by a school teacher and had been paying attention to spaces and how people lived in them her whole life would have opinions about how a room should be arranged to make people feel welcome rather than merely housed. They went together to the dry goods store and the second-hand dealer and the carpentry shop and assembled the rooms piece by piece, making decisions with the specific shared shorthand of 2 people who have been working together long enough that a look substitutes for a sentence. During those 6 weeks, Clara made her own decision. She came to Martha on a Thursday evening, Martha's evening on the back steps, which had remained her evening on the back steps even after Daniel's formal departure from Agnes's boarding house, which had happened and which she was not yet ready to think about in all its dimensions, and sat down beside her and said, with the directness that had been Clara's nature from the beginning, I'd like to stay and help run it, the new house, if you and Agnes will have me. Martha looked at her, 22 years old, widowed, skilled, attentive, possessed of her mother's schoolteacher precision and her own particular quality of caring about things without sentimentality. What about the deciding what comes next? Martha asked. You've been doing that for 6 months. I've decided, Clara said. This is what comes next. Martha was quiet for a moment. It's not an easy life, she said. Women in difficult circumstances are not always easy to help. They're sometimes frightened and sometimes angry, and sometimes they've been treated badly for so long that kindness looks like threat. I know, Clara said. Do you? My mother ran a schoolhouse for 20 years, Clara said. Half those children were frightened, and some of them were angry, and some of them came from homes where things had gone badly enough that kindness confused them. She helped them anyway. She showed me how. She paused. I think this is the same work, just different people at different stages. Martha looked at her for a long time, in the way she had been looking at people ever since the storm, with the specific attentiveness of someone who has discovered that people are worth looking at carefully, that the truth of who they are is usually there if you're willing to see it. Yes, she said. You can stay. Clara exhaled. Just slightly, just the small, audible release of someone who has been holding something and has been given permission to set it down. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Martha said. Elliot Gruber is painting the parlor tomorrow, and the paint he chose is the wrong color, and someone needs to tell him before he does the second coat. Clara stood up. What color should it be? The blue, Martha said. The one we looked at in Hendrix's store. Not the gray blue, the clear blue. Clara went inside to find the paint card, And Martha sat on the back steps in the cooling evening and looked at the cottonwood at the end of the alley, and the nighthawk was there, still working the dusk air, still banking and diving in that particular committed way. And she watched it for a while with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have come to appreciate that the ordinary world, simply persisting in its ordinary ways, is no small thing. Folks, Daniel came back in October. The cottonwoods had gone yellow by then, the good clear yellow of fall in the Nebraska Valley, and the air had the particular crisp quality of a season that has decided to be itself completely rather than linger in summer's margins. He came into Fort Carson on a Tuesday afternoon on Bay, looking the same as he had looked the morning he'd ridden out, the same weathered steadiness, the same economy of motion, the same hat. And he tied the horse at Agnes's post and knocked, and Agnes opened the door and said without apparent surprise, "She's next door." He found Martha in the new building's kitchen, sitting at the table across from a woman he didn't recognize, perhaps 50, with the particular wariness of someone who has recently arrived somewhere she wasn't sure she'd be welcome. Martha was talking to her in the specific quiet voice she used when she was giving someone room to decide how much to say, and the woman was deciding, and the deciding was visible on her face. Martha heard him come in, but didn't look up immediately. She kept her attention on the woman across the table until the woman had said what she was working towards saying, a sentence, halting, about a farm and a husband and a situation that Martha understood completely before the sentence finished. And then she said quietly, "You're safe here. That's the only thing that matters right now. We'll figure the rest out together." The woman looked at the table, then at Martha, and something in her face changed in the specific way that things change in a person's face when they have been given the most necessary thing and have recognized it as real. Then Martha looked up at Daniel. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the afternoon light was coming in the kitchen window in the long, sideways, amber way of October afternoons, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, or rather, she had seen its components separately, but not assembled like this, not all at once. The steadiness was there, and the patience, and the particular quality of presence that had been his from the beginning. But there was something else now, something that had been building through 4 months of absence and a route that had taken him from Fort Carson to the Cedar Creek line to the Jessup place and back again, something that had been accumulating in the long silences of 12 years of solitary work, and had arrived, finally, at the specific clarity of a man who knows what he is riding back toward. "I'll wait," he said quietly, nodding toward the woman at the table. "There's coffee on the stove," Martha said. "Pour yourself a cup." He did. He sat in the chair near the window and drank his coffee and looked out at the October street, and Martha returned her attention to the woman at the table, and the afternoon went on around them both in the easy, unforced way of people who have learned each other well enough that presence doesn't require performance. An hour later, when the woman had been settled in her room upstairs and Clara had been introduced and the necessary practical things had been arranged, Martha and Daniel sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee and the particular quiet of two people who have not seen each other in 4 months and are still, somehow, in the middle of a conversation that began in a doorway in a storm. "How's the route?" she asked. "Quieter than it was," he said. "The Harmon Ranch hired permanent hands this fall. Jessup's nephew is taking over the east fence line." He looked at his coffee. "The circuit's getting smaller." She looked at him. "Das. Is that a problem?" He looked up. "Depends on what there is instead," he said. Martha held his eyes for a moment. Those steady, patient, undeceiving eyes that had been the first honest thing she'd seen in the doorway of the Jessup cabin in the rain. "There's work here," she said. "The building next door needs maintenance I don't have the hands for. Agnes's barn needs a new gate. The eastern fence along the property line was pointed out to me last week as someone's job for the spring." She paused. "And there's a room on the second floor that's been sitting empty since we opened." He was quiet for a moment. "A room on the second floor," he said. "A small room," she said. "Good window. Gets the morning light. That's not a hardship." "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at the table, then at the window, then at her, with the specific looking of a man who is orienting himself, who is taking the measure of a place and a moment and a person and finding that the measure is good, that the wait is what he hoped it was, that the thing he has been riding back toward is here and is real and does not diminish on arrival. "All right," he said. 2 words. The most economical possible yes. And yet they carried exactly what they needed to carry. The decision, the commitment, the specific willingness of a quiet man to stop moving long enough to let something matter. Martha nodded once, short and decided, in the way she had nodded at decisions her whole life. "Good," she said, and poured him more coffee. The first women moved into the new building on the 1st of November, 1875. There were 7 of them on that first day, women of various ages and various circumstances, each carrying the specific weight of having arrived at Agnes Parker's door because somewhere between where they had started and here, the ground had been pulled out from under them. 2 were widows in their 40s. One was a young woman, barely 20, traveling alone and heading west toward a brother who may or may not have still been at the address she had for him. One was a woman of 60, whose children had moved on and whose farm had failed in the drought, and who had simply, one morning, packed what she could carry and started walking toward something she couldn't yet name. The other 3 had circumstances they were not yet ready to speak and were not asked to. Agnes welcomed each of them at the door with the same unceremonious practicality she had used for every arrival. The step back, the door open, the direction to the kitchen where the coffee was hot, and there was no requirement yet to be anything but a person who has arrived. Martha stood in the parlor of the new building on that first morning and watched it happen, and felt something she had been feeling for weeks in its full form for the first time. The specific, rooted satisfaction of a life pointed in the right direction. Not contentment, which was too still. Not triumph, which was too loud. Something between those things and beyond them both. The quiet, active pleasure of a purpose that fits, that uses what you actually are rather than what circumstances have temporarily required you to be. She was 65 years old. She had ridden 40 miles in a storm with bleeding hands. She had sat in a courtroom for 4 days and listened to the full record of what had been done to her, and said nothing until it was her moment to speak, and then said everything. She had decided when she had the right to decide, and the deciding had brought her here. Not back to the land she had fought for, not back to the life exactly as it had been, but forward into something that could not have been built without everything the last year had cost her. The women moved into the rooms upstairs, and Agnes moved through the new building with the proprietorial attentiveness she brought to everything, checking that the fires were drawing properly, and the water was hot, and the practical architecture of daily life was in place. Clara sat with the young woman who was traveling west and helped her write a letter to the brother who may or may not still be at the address, the school teacher's handwriting appearing in the young woman's letter like something borrowed and passed on. Daniel repaired the barn gate in the morning cold and came inside at noon and ate lunch at the big table with whoever was there. Without ceremony, without explanation, as though this had always been how things went. Outside, the cottonwoods were fully gold now, losing leaves in the dry October wind, each leaf lifting and turning in the specific unhurried way of things released rather than fallen. The Nebraska sky above them was the absolute blue of autumn, the kind of blue that seems to go on past the visible, past the edge of what a person can locate the end of. Martha stood at the kitchen window in the afternoon light and looked at it. The sky and the cottonwoods and the Fort Carson street going about its business in the turning season, and felt the specific quality of the present moment that she had been too frightened or too busy or too focused on the next necessary thing to feel for a very long time. She was here. She had chosen to be here. That was not a small thing. She knew now, with the specific knowledge of someone who has nearly had the choice taken from them, that it was not a small thing at all. The right to choose where you stand and what you do with the days you have remaining, that right, so easily overlooked when no one is threatening it, was the whole of what she had fought for. Not the land, not the deed, not the verdict, though all of those had been necessary. The right itself. The right that Thomas had written down and filed and documented with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the most important things are the ones worth protecting in writing. She had protected it, and now she was using it. She turned from the window. Clara was at the table helping the young traveling woman. Agnes was somewhere upstairs. Daniel's voice came in from the barn, talking to someone. The sound of a man who is comfortable in a place, whose voice has settled into the register it takes when a person has decided to stay. In the parlor, the woman of 60 who had walked away from the failed farm with what she could carry was sitting in a chair by the window with her hands in her lap, looking out at the street with the particular expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and is beginning, slowly, to take its measure. Martha went and sat in the chair across from her. The woman looked at her. She had the kind of face that has been weathered by outdoor work and internal trouble in equal measure, a face that had held a great deal and was still holding it, still deciding what could be set down. "My name is Martha," she said. "Ruth," the woman said. Not the Ruth who was already part of Agnes's household. A different Ruth, which was simply how it was, names recurring in a life the way certain weather recurs, and you learn to tell the people apart by what they did rather than what they were called. "You've had a long road," Martha said. "Yes," the woman said, just the one word, but it carried the weight of the road honestly. "So have I," Martha said. "So has everyone in this house." She looked at the woman steadily. "But you're here now, and here is solid. Whatever comes next, you figure it out from solid ground." The woman looked at her. Her eyes were the particular color of eyes that have been dry a long time. Not from toughness, but from having run out of what tears require, that specific resource of available grief that exhausts itself eventually and leaves something else in its place, something harder and quieter and more durable. "How do you know?" she asked. Martha thought about a door opening in a storm. She thought about a man stepping to the side and saying, "The choice is yours." She thought about 40 miles of dark prairie and bleeding hands, and the specific moment in the ravine when she had ridden down a hill toward 3 armed men with her voice shaking and her eyes steady, and said the truest thing she knew. "Because I stood where you're standing," she said, "and the ground held." The woman looked at the window. The cottonwood leaves were moving in the wind, gold and easy. After a while she nodded. It was a small movement, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were what this house was for. The specific, necessary, unglamorous work of helping people locate the ground beneath them and discover that it holds, that they hold, that 65 or 20 or whatever age the road has brought them to is not an ending arrived at too soon, but a starting point they haven't recognized yet, waiting to be chosen. Outside, the afternoon light was long and amber and running westward across the prairie in the way it runs in October, low and reaching, touching everything it finds. Martha Whitmore sat in her chair in the parlor of the new building and let it reach her, and it did, and it was enough, and it was the beginning.